fraudo, frengo, frustro, frango, barbaros. Heya, 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 heya. Frico, flaxo, fraudo, frengo, frustro, frango, barbaros.
Good evening, my name is Eve, this is my channel, and tonight we are dishing on the novel The Metamorphoses, or The Golden Ass by Apuleius, with an emphasis on its adaptation and interpretation throughout the millennia, particularly the 1970 film version. I originally intended to just focus on the film version, but through my research, it really just spiraled into looking at not just the novel, but also Apuleius' real life and the historical context in which he was writing, as well as other works of art, film, and literature. So whether it's an interest in Apuleius as an author, the evolution and impact of the Roman novel, the symbolism of Cupid and Psyche, or just curiosity that brought you here, I really hope I can address each of those topics in a way that they deserve. You might have noticed me holding this. This is my script, so if you see me glancing down and looking back up again, that's what's going on. This is also my first time doing like a video essay format, and so I really apologize if a lot of it seems rough. I definitely think my setup is going to change a lot in the near future, but this is what we have for now. I also know some of you who may not be new to the channel might remember in my last video that I had suggested the idea of doing a speed paint while I talked about this, but even though I had a few ideas that I really liked, I felt like while I really want to return to the book and the movie as artistic subjects, I do not really feel like this is the time to do that. There are just a few more notes before we really get started. First of all, this video has a few content warnings, and there will be more information about that in the description. So please be advised that if you feel like you need to skip those, you absolutely can. And the last kind of warning is that there will be spoilers for both the book The Golden Ass by Apuleius as well as the movie L'Inodoro by Sergio Spina. And so if you're not up for any of that, I totally understand. And if you're still interested in the topics themselves, I would recommend my second art blog, which is up on my channel, and I will try and like do a card up here, and it contains a much abbreviated discussion of the movie and the book without talking about any potentially triggering themes or any major spoilers. And there is another disclaimer, which is that when talking about the general plot, characters, and themes of The Golden Ass, I am referencing a professional translation. The ones I looked at especially were Robert Graves and E.J. Kenny, but when I am quoting specific passages or calling out specific language, those have been translated by me, and a lot of the sources that I ended up consulting, especially getting towards the film, are in Italian, and of course the movie itself is in Italian, but Italian is not my native language, so if I made any particularly grievous mistakes in translating anything, or especially in my interpretation of anything, please let me know. I also just know that whether I say it with the accent or not, nobody's going to be happy. So I'm just going to talk. I'm going to do my best to be mindful of the original pronunciation in the native language. With all that said, this is not at all like an academic production. This video was just born out of my own interest, so it's going to be biased in many ways, but I will leave the links for all the sources that I consulted in the description, and I would highly encourage you to look at any of those that spark your interest, that are calling to you, because I really had so much fun researching this video, and I really enjoyed all of the articles that I read. They're all by people who are much more informed and much more educated on Apuleius in general than I am. So thank you for sitting through all that. I hope you are cozy and safe and settled in for this little deep dive into everything Apuleius. So earlier this year, I was lucky enough to encounter the movie L'Asino d'Oro, processo per fatti strani contro Lucius Apuleius, cittadino romano, which from now on we'll call L'Asino d'Oro, being a film adaptation of the Roman novel titled The Metamorphoses, or in modern times, The Golden Ass by Apuleius. I talked a tiny bit about it in my last video, as I already mentioned, but over time, I kept coming back to a single question, a single word, a single syllable in my mind. Why? So I thought it was time to revisit Apuleius' novel in its full context, to take a closer look at its adaptation and all of the creative and narrative choices that are going on there. Because the film is modeled more closely on Apuleius' real life than the fictional account that makes up The Golden Ass, and because we'll need to take more time to go through a few specific episodes and their implications, I am going to kind of do the bare minimum of context right now, just so we can jump right in. There will be more explanation of the book's contents afterwards, so if you just like freshly translated The Golden Ass for your Latin class, or you're very familiar with the story already, feel free to skip this chapter. So The Golden Ass is most likely an adaptation of an earlier novel by a Greek author called Lucius Apuleius, which is probably also the basis for the more famous Greek novelist Lucian's story, which is also titled The Ass. The Metamorphoses is actually probably its original title, and De Asinus Aureus, or The Golden Ass, was attached to the manuscript in the Middle Ages, but I have decided to call it The Golden Ass because that is just more frequently used these days, and also in order to distinguish it from other works of literature. So E.J. Kenny, who is the translator upon whose work I based large sections of this recap, also compiled an appendix in his translation of all of the episodes shared between different versions of the same donkey transformation story that occurs at different points in Greek and Roman literature, and it really shows how much Apuleius added and expanded into a story type that was probably already very well known. And so we will discuss later which episodes are very specific to Apuleius and why, but in this version we can definitely expect stories with a greater emphasis on religion and witchcraft, as well as the addition of many inset stories that give the novel a more folkloric character. The Golden Ass stars a young, educated man named Lucius who is traveling through Thessaly in northern Greece with his companion Aristomenes. The two are enchanted by the many stories of witchcraft and the scheming women that they meet along the way, and eventually end up staying in the city Hypata with a man named Milo whose wife Pamphile is a witch. And the more Lucius learns about this new world, the more he becomes obsessed with learning the secrets of witchcraft for himself. During this time, Lucius also begins an affair with Milo's slave Fotis, whom he soon begins to see as his ticket to becoming a witch himself. So one day, as Lucius and Fotis are snooping around the house, they spy on Pamphile turning herself into a bird. Lucius begs Fotis to recreate the ritual on him, but she screws it up, and instead of a bird, she ends up turning him into a really pissed off donkey. Fotis tells Lucius the only way to reverse the transformation is by eating fresh roses, which she promises to bring him in the morning. But overnight, a group of robbers raid the house, and they make off with Milo's valuables, which includes Lucius. Back at their hideout, Lucius enters the company of an old woman, an accomplice of the robbers, and a younger woman named Charite, who has been kidnapped. Charite is crying at being taken away from her family and everything she loves, especially her fiancé Tlepolemus. In order to comfort her, the old woman begins to tell one of the most famous stories from The Golden Ass, the story of Cupid and Psyche. A king and a queen had 3 daughters, and the youngest of these was so beautiful that anyone who saw her would press their fingers to their lips and praise her as if she were Venus herself. She was so beautiful that rumor even spread that Venus had been sowing her divine seed among mortals, or, most shocking of all, that a new Venus had been born from the earth rather than the sea. Soon people from near and far were visiting the palace just as if it were a shrine or a temple, bringing gifts and sacrifices to lay at the princess's feet. This young woman was called Psyche. With her own temples and altars deserted in favor of Psyche's palace, Venus ordered Cupid, in this version of the myth her son, to arm himself with his bow and quiver of arrows, and to unite Psyche in love with the most degraded, vile, wretched man to walk the mortal earth. But Cupid is so moved by Psyche's innocence and her loveliness that he plans to hide her away from Venus and marry her himself. The goddess's plan is all the more poignant for the fact that, despite her many suitors, Psyche had never found a match from any of them, who all looked at her as if she were a statue and not a real human being. Her sisters enjoy wealthy, high-ranking husbands, despite not being as beautiful as Psyche, and one day her father visits the oracle of Apollo Miletus to ask for advice in marrying off his youngest daughter. The oracle replies that the king should prepare his daughter for a marriage, then expose her on a cliff top where a winged monster will come to take her away. The king is heartbroken but compelled to follow the god's orders. Psyche bravely and piously begs her parents not to weep, and she says that if there was a time for mourning, it was when their subjects were starting to worship her as a mortal Venus. But despite her fears, she says that she can't wait to meet her new husband, whatever he is. So alone on the mountain peak, the wind Zephyr comes to lift Psyche down to the valley floor where she falls asleep in the grasses. He wakes up the next morning well rested and on the grounds of a beautiful palace, which she works up the courage to enter and explore. A disembodied voice then speaks to her, telling her to enjoy the house as much as she wants, since all of it belongs to her, and all of the voices that she hears are her attendants. When Psyche sits down for a luxurious dinner, each course floats onto and is cleared from the table through the air, as if by the wind, and all of the singers and musicians who perform afterwards are also invisible. After dinner, she goes to her bedroom to wait for her husband, with fear and anticipation. He arrives, has sex with her, and leaves before morning and before she can learn who he is. Things continue in this routine, and Psyche starts to adjust to her unusual situation. One day, she hears her husband's voice telling her that her sisters, who think she is dead, will come to the mountaintop and weep for her the next day. This is painful enough for Psyche, who has already been completely cut off from the human world, but her husband also orders her not to try and meet them. She spends the whole next day crying and wishing she could reassure their pain. Finally, her husband agrees to let her visit her sisters and bring them gifts, as long as she is careful not to attempt to find out, nor to reveal any part of his identity. Zephyr brings the sisters to Psyche's palace, and they bathe together. The sisters are extremely curious about her husband, and if he really is the winged monster in Apollo's prophecy, but Psyche remembers her instructions, and she makes up a story about a handsome young man who is off hunting. Psyche then quickly sends them off, loaded with gifts, before she lets their questions get to her. But the sisters are already wise to what's going on, and become envious of Psyche's wealth and her husband, who is obviously some type of god. Back at the palace, Psyche's husband speaks to her again and tells her that she is pregnant. He says that if she tells nobody, then their child will be divine. But if she tells anybody, then the child will be born as a mortal. He also warns her about her sister's jealousy. Psyche is excited to become a mother, especially a mother to a god, and hopes that although she cannot see her husband's face now, perhaps their child will look like him. She soothes his worries about her sisters and asks to see them again when she will be able to prove herself and that they are no threat to the secrecy of her marriage. So the sisters arrive a second time and shower Psyche with praise and adoration for her pregnancy. One even says that she must be carrying a little Cupid because of how pretty both the child's parents are, and again begins asking after the father. Psyche is distracted by her own joy, and she forgets the story she'd already told them about a handsome young man, and instead she makes up a new husband who is a merchant, wealthy and middle-aged, but still attractive in his years. The sisters know that if she is pregnant but has clearly never even seen her husband, he must be a god. This makes them furious, and they return to the palace the very next morning to execute their evil plan. They tell Psyche that her husband is a monstrous serpent, only fattening her up to eat her once her pregnancy progresses to full term. Therefore, to save her own life, she must hide an oil lamp and a knife in her bed and kill him when he comes to sleep with her that night. Psyche is both terrified and persuaded by her sister's words. She prepares the knife and the oil lamp, and as soon as she feels her husband sleeping beside her, she raises the lamp to gaze upon the softest and sweetest of all wild beasts, the god Cupid. Psyche can't tear herself away from the sight of the golden curls tumbling down his neck, his rosy cheeks, his body as smooth and milky white as marble, and the dewy feathered wings at his shoulders that ripple and flutter with glittering down. Overcome with desire, Psyche devours him with kisses and caresses, fearful that he might wake up and discover her betrayal. Of course, in her passion, she allows a drop of the hot oil to fall onto Cupid's shoulder, which burns him. He spreads his wings and flies from her arms into the night, disappearing without a trace. The next morning, he addresses her and explains how he came to fall in love with her against his mother Venus's will. Her only punishment for now is that he will leave her and her sisters will get their own punishment in time. As Psyche wanders the valley mourning her loss, the god Pan encourages her to devote herself to Cupid's worship, and since he is a wanton and indulgent character, he is likely to change his mind. Psyche prays to Cupid and leaves the valley to wander along a road, which soon takes her into the city ruled by one of her sister's husbands. She decides to take revenge herself, and after exchanging greetings and embraces with her sister, tells her the events of the previous night, embellished with the additional detail that Cupid had said he would marry one of Psyche's sisters in her place. The sister excuses herself in order to hurry to the mountaintop where Zephyr had taken Psyche. The sister eagerly cries out for the winds to take her as well, and jumps off the mountaintop to her death. While Psyche continues to scour the earth looking for Cupid, the god himself has withdrawn into Olympus, and rumor starts to spread that he is neglecting his offices because he has taken a lover. Venus becomes furious, even more so when she learns that the very same lover who has been debauching her son's reputation is her rival Psyche, whom she specifically instructed him to pair with a really disgusting monster. She scolds him for making her enemy her daughter-in-law, and complains how he has already tortured her by providing her lover Ares with partners. Finally, Venus threatens to strip away all his weapons, his golden hair that she has caressed to shining perfection, and his wings that she groomed with nectar from her very breasts. Leaving her palace, Venus first happens upon Ceres and Juno, but is even more offended when the other goddesses try to brush off Cupid's behavior and remind her that he is still a young man despite his childish form, and she can't control him forever. So Venus returns to the sea in anger. Back in the mortal realm, in her travels, Psyche comes across a deserted temple. She sees piles of corn and barley and farm tools lying disorganized, and without a second thought begins organizing them in order to give proper respect to the house of a god. While she is doing this, Ceres, to whom the temple is dedicated, appears to her and Psyche pleads her case. Ceres is sympathetic, but she cannot betray her friend Venus. So Psyche enters a second temple to pray to Juno. Juno says she also wishes she could help, but she can't interfere with Venus's will. Psyche then decides to give up searching for Cupid and to abandon herself to Venus's mercy. So Venus brings her before a huge pile of beans, chickpeas, seeds, lentils, and grains of all descriptions, and sets her a first task, which is to separate all of the wheat from the millet, the barley from the poppy seeds, all of that stuff, before Venus returns from dinner. While Psyche is standing frozen in shock and despair, a line of ants appears and begins to sort the pile themselves, soon making fast work of the whole thing. Venus is still not satisfied and gives Psyche a casket, which she must carry to Proserpina in the underworld and bring back filled with a day's worth of Proserpina's beauty. Psyche plans to kill herself again by jumping off of a tower, but the tower itself speaks to her and tells her where to find the entrance to the underworld, how to pass through the river Styx, and the many traps Venus has laid for her, and above all, never even think of opening the casket. Psyche obeys all of these warnings, but on the journey back, she cannot resist opening the casket. The casket has been filled with eternal sleep, and Psyche collapses where she stood on the road. Cupid, who has become sickly from being shut up in his mother's palace, summons the strength to go to her and gently wipes away all the sleep to replace into the casket. He wakes Psyche with a prick of his arrow and encourages her to fulfill her promise to Venus while he appeals to Jupiter. Jupiter agrees to go along with Cupid's marriage, even though Cupid has never respected him the way other gods should and has caused Jupiter to disgrace himself by constantly getting involved in love affairs with mortals. The proviso of this agreement is that the next time Cupid finds a pretty girl on Earth, he brings her straight to Jupiter. So Jupiter is very happy with this agreement, and he calls a meeting of the gods to announce Cupid and Psyche's marriage. He says the union is necessary to curb Cupid's licentious behavior, and reassures Venus that her son's marriage will be no threat to her own status. Jupiter orders Mercury to bring Psyche before him, where she drinks nectar and eats ambrosia and becomes immortal. They celebrate with a wedding feast catered by Vulcan, attended by Ganymede and Liber, perfumed by the Graces, and sprinkled with flowers by the season. And so Cupid and Psyche live happily ever after. Psyche gives birth to their child, who is a daughter named Pleasure. After the old woman concludes her story, Charite and Lucius decide to escape, but the robbers soon catch up to them at a crossroads and decide to kill them by sewing Charite into Lucius's stomach and exposing them both on a rock. Just in time, a young man posing as another thief approaches the gang and distracts them with the details of the Milo situation back in Hippada. So Milo's house has been robbed, and everybody believes the villain is Lucius, who passed himself off as a nice, educated young man, seduced Fotis, ingratiated himself with the other members of the household, and robbed them only to disappear without a trace the next morning. Lucius laments his humanity and the assassination of his character, but he can only protest by braying wordlessly. The newcomer deposits some gold into the robber's treasury and asks to introduce them to his companion, who is also in disguise as a famous thief named Hymus. The robbers are eager to meet him, and they bring him in. Hymus shares his life story, which involves a little vignette about an imperial commissioner and his wife named Plotina. After her husband is disgraced, Plotina is so virtuous and devoted that she poses as a man in order to accompany him into exile. While the couple camps out near Actium, Hymus and his thieves decide to despoil them of their imperial riches. However, Plotina wakes as soon as she hears the robbers, and she raises the entire neighborhood against them. Each thief narrowly escapes with his life, and the emperor grants Plotina's husband a pardon for his wife's bravery. The emperor also issues death warrants for every man in Hymus's band of thieves, who are all picked off one by one except Hymus himself, who ironically escapes capture by posing as a woman. So Lucius's kidnappers elect Hymus as their new leader, and after telling him about their troublesome captives, he proposes that they just sell Charite and Lucius rather than putting them both to death. The robbers agree, and they share a drink with the stranger, not knowing that he is actually Charite's fiancé, Tlepolemus, in disguise. Once the thieves are all passed out drunk, Tlepolemus kills them and releases their captives. Sadly, this isn't happily ever after for the young couple, who both come to an end at the hands of an evil admirer, nor for Lucius. Charite had entrusted him to the stable master in her household, but the horses in the stable are mean to him, especially the rutting stallions, who foil Lucius's strange and possibly latent desire for horse sex. And this brings us to our first important philosophical dilemma that the Golden Ass poses to us as readers. If a man turns into a donkey, is it worse for him to pursue relations with other equines or with humans? Lucius does both, but it's like he's clearly disgusted by being a donkey. Like, he doesn't even like eating hay and stuff like that. So why is this like the one part where he's like, I could get used to this? Anyway, things only get worse when he is put on stick-carrying duty for one of the stable hands. The boy thrashes him until sores crack open all over his body, which he beats into crevasses, and wraps Lucius's tail in thorns so that it will prick him if he tries to run away. When Lucius can't take it anymore, he aims a kick at his vicious little master, but the stable hand punishes him by placing a hot coal into Lucius's next load, which sets it on fire. I'm not sure how this wasn't the end of things, because he actually just tried to kill Lucius, but that wasn't the end of it. He rolls around in some mud and he's fine. And the final straw is that the stable hand accuses Lucius of approaching human passerby with carnal intentions. And so Lucius is very upset about that, probably because he wishes he had actually thought to do that first, but his master and the other stable hands decide to castrate him before the threat can be executed. The next morning, the stable boy leads Lucius up a mountain to gather wood and ties him up next to a cave. As the stable hand leaves on his own duty, a bear comes out of the cave and sends Lucius flying down the mountain, screaming his head off. A short while later, some of the herdsmen find him and they bring him back to the stable. Everyone is furious, and now they intend to have Lucius's head as well as his balls, because in running off, he'd abandoned the stable hand to his death at the bear's claws. The boy's mother is especially furious and beats Lucius as well as branding his groin with an iron. Again, before these threats can be realized, Lucius is stolen by Charite and Tlepolemus's household slaves once they hear of their owner's deaths. But while the freedmen are seeking refuge, an old shepherd and his goats approach them and warn them away from the place. The shepherd leaves the freedmen and Lucius in confusion, but just then another old man comes along the road, weeping and dragging his feet. This new old man says that his grandson has fallen into a pit in the earth, and while the boy is still alive, the old man is not strong enough to save him. One of Lucius's party goes off in search of the man's grandson, but he doesn't return even after the others have started gathering up their belongings to leave, so they send a second member of their group in order to search for the rescuer. The messenger comes back white with fear and shock. He had found what remained of their Good Samaritan under a huge writhing serpent, with no sign of the old man. The group realizes that this weeping grandfather, the serpent in disguise, was the danger that the shepherd had warned them about, and they leave in a hurry. Lucius and his new friends eagerly set off seeking a warmer welcome in a nearby city, where the freedmen decide to sell some of their animals. While the other friendly, nice horses and donkeys quickly find eager buyers, Lucius is stuck up on the auction block and growing tired of being handled and inspected, so he bites one of the men who is checking his teeth. Having been on the auction block for so long, and clearly being a four-legged nightmare to deal with, the auctioneer uses this to do a little stand-up comedy at Lucius's expense.
You do not see a donkey, but a gentleman having enjoyed all leisures, neither snappish nor kicking, but in fact by all means such that you would believe a mild-tempered man to dwell within his hide.
So Lucius is gagged at this, no less when a eunuch priest in one of the Eastern cults, the text doesn't specify which one, approaches and actually expresses interest in buying Lucius, but not without asking a few annoying questions. Showtime at the Apollo isn't finished for the auctioneer, who continues answering humorously at the priest and Lucius's expense.
Certainly an astrologer who casts the stars numbered 5 years for him, but the beast himself surely knows this better from his public register. Although I am aware I would commit a crime under the Lex Cornelii by selling you a Roman citizen as a slave, nevertheless, why don't you buy this good and useful servant who will be able to assist you at home and out of doors?
And he even describes Lucius, though in complete jest, as a man in a donkey's hide. The priest scolds the auctioneer for his mockery, but buys Lucius anyway and takes him back to his lodgings. Lucius here becomes acquainted with the rest of the little cult, who make a living by bringing their shrine around the countryside and performing public rituals. Immediately, they become way too comfortable, joking about how the head priest has brought home a new husband and he had better not keep Lucius all to himself, and Lucius is no more relieved at the suspiciously hearty welcome he receives from the flute boy in the cult, who is clearly eager to be relieved of his own obligations to the priests. He passes the night tossing and turning in distress until the group sets out the next morning. They place their shrine on Lucius's back and parade through the streets, collecting offerings and gifts from the people. Lucius is disgusted at their worship, and I thought this part was really interesting to think about in comparison with the end of the novel, so I want you to kind of bookmark it in your mind. He describes the religious ecstasy that is performed by one of the priests as giving the impression that divine inspiration causes pain or causes suffering rather than causing joy, and he believes that all of their actions are completely making a mockery out of religion, and that they are not genuine devotees of their goddess, but really putting on a cheap show for a few denarii. But the townspeople are more appreciative, so the priests load Lucius with the day's profits, and they decide to celebrate with a banquet after a visit to the baths. Here at the baths, the priests find a handsome youth to invite back with them for dinner. But once they return, they strip the boy and demand his favors. Lucius can't put up with it anymore, and he starts loudly braying for help, trying to call out any coherent language, but he becomes frustrated at his inability to form human speech. Luckily, some locals rush to the scene and they rescue the youth, which forces the priests to pack up. After traveling until daylight, they stop to deliberate on their next move and decide to kill Lucius. They tie him up and whip him, but in the end, their devotion to their goddess reminds them to spare his life. The priests eventually reach an extravagant villa where the homeowner, a devotee, welcomes them with open arms. Here, Lucius again almost meets his maker when a cook realizes a dog has stolen a leg of venison that he was going to prepare for dinner that night. The cook's wife suggests he prepare an entree of baked Lucius rather than face his master's wrath. Lucius runs away through the garden and burst straight through the wall of the dining room of the house. The host is good-humored enough to lock him back up in his stable, but just then another household slave bursts in, sharing the news that a rabid dog has been attacking the animals and staff outside. The homeowner starts to fear that Lucius had been bitten, which is why he was acting so strangely, and so the whole group chases after him with spears and axes until they corner him in the priest's room. But they decide to leave him there until the disease kills him naturally. Here, according to Lucius, he finds his first night of deep human sleep. The household devise a test in which they will bring him a bucket of water. If he drinks it, then he is perfectly healthy, but if he acts afraid or if he panics, then he's still rabid. Lucius eagerly drinks the water and allows the slaves to pet him and bridle him as much as they like, until they decide that he is safe and he can leave with the priest. Staying the night at an inn, Lucius overhears another very well-known and very well-parodied story from the Golden Ass. One day, after a poor man leaves for work, his wife brings her lover to the house and they spend the entire morning together. But at some point, the husband unexpectedly returns and he actually commends his wife's virtue to find the door so securely closed and locked. He knocks and announces himself, at which the wife hurriedly stows her lover away in a storage jar before confronting her spouse for his laziness to leave work so early in the day. The suspicious husband tells her his boss is in court and so he has the day off and he's decided to spend it getting rid of their useless clutter, starting with the storage jar. The husband says he has already arranged a buyer who will come over to inspect and collect it. But the wife is more clever than him and laughs at his proposal, saying that she's already found a buyer who is willing to hand over a much healthier stack of denarii for the same old storage jar. And he's inside the jar as they speak. The lover takes this cue to emerge from the jar and ask the husband for a light so that he can better assess its state. The husband eagerly climbs inside to inspect the jar, and the wife leans over him to make sure he doesn't miss a spot, while instructing both her husband to clean inside the jar and her lover, who stands behind her. When both jobs were finished, the husband collected 7 denarii for the jar and carried it himself to the lover's house. After a few days in this town, the priests cook up a new get-rich-quick scheme, which is to come up with one single all-purpose oracle that they can go around selling to people no matter what question they may ask. They make a fair living out of this, but of course have to keep moving on more and more quickly so that people don't catch on to the fact that they're giving the same answer every single time. On the road, a group of armed horsemen ambushes them and accuses the priests of blasphemy and stealing a sacred gold cup from a temple, which they use in their fraudulent rituals. The priests are taken into custody, and Lucius finds himself on the auction block for the second time. His new master is a miller whom Lucius describes as a kind and honorable man, but who keeps a stable full of emaciated farm animals, turning the millstone day in and day out. The very next day, he puts Lucius in chains and blinders and fastens him to the mill. Lucius pretends like he does not know what a mill is, but this is met with a vicious beating from the farmhands. After a day of merciless labor and toil, and seeing the horrible state of his comrades, both man and beast, Lucius abandons all hope and prepares to die. At this point, he shares some reflections with the reader that, looking back, he does not think any of these ordeals made him any wiser, but he is grateful to Lucius the Ass for making him more informed. The miller and his wife are a particular source of gossip, drama, and disgust for Lucius. For some reason, he likes the miller, even though he is being worked to the bone under his supervision, but his wife is a woman, and so she is worse. She not only harasses the miller enough to make even poor little Lucius feel sorry for him, but her affairs and sexual vices are endless in diversity and depravity, and that's not even the worst of it. She has also fabricated an entirely new religion of her own, under the cover of which she spends all day drinking her wine neat and fucking the nearest, warmest creature she can get her hands on. It's tempting to focus on this character's sexual perversions, but take note of the religious ones too. The miller's wife also keeps in her company an old woman who acts as a procurer, with whom she also often schemes of how to kill her husband. One day, as Lucius eavesdrops on the old woman's daily briefing, he overhears her tell yet another salacious short story about a famous lover named Dulcitherus. A beautiful, virtuous woman named Arete was possessed of such a jealous husband named Barbarus that he kept her under lock, key, and the eyes of a slave named Myrmex. Arete nevertheless captures Philocytheres' attention, who contrives to get Myrmex alone and bribe him with 20 gold coins for Arete and 10 for Myrmex himself. Myrmex is conflicted, but Arete is a woman and eagerly accepts Philocytheres' offer. Of course, as Philocytheres and Arete are enjoying themselves, Barbarus comes home. Philocytheres has just enough time to make his escape, but not enough to remember his sandals, which he leaves under the bed. Barbarus notices these in the morning and accuses Myrmex of having let a lover into the house, so he ties him up and leads him through the streets, where they meet Philocytheres. Philocytheres begins to berate Myrmex as a thief who has taken his sandals. This fools Barbarus, who apologetically restores Myrmex to favor and the sandals to Philocytheres. With this story finished, the miller's wife starts complaining that her own company is cowardly and ungrateful, unlike Philocytheres. The old woman promises to furnish some more open-minded companions for that evening, when the husband would be dining out. So later that day, the old woman returns with a very young boy, and the miller's wife is just sitting down to dinner with him when, as you might be able to anticipate, the husband knocks at the door. She shoves the boy under a grain bin next to Lucius's stall and begins to annoy the miller with complaints and excuses for the two place settings, while he tells her about some unusual events that happened at dinner. The wife of the town fuller, who is hosting the miller and his friends, hid her lover in a cage that the fuller had used for bleaching clothes with sulfur when they unexpectedly show up. He starts suffocating from the fumes, which to me begs the question of if anything was really going to happen in a room that literally smells like fire and brimstone. And he sneezes. The fuller wants to kill him, but the miller points out that he's already half dead from the fumes, so instead they just drag him out and leave him in an alley. The fuller was still furious, so the miller persuaded his wife to also step out for a little bit while he returned to his own house in disgust. So while this is going on, Lucius decides that this is his time to step up and just be the miller's #1 fan and step on the kid's hand that is poking out of the grain bin. The miller locks his wife away before he rapes and beats the boy and chases him out of the house the next morning. I should add that this isn't even the outcome that Lucius was hoping for, just that he wanted the kid to be executed for adultery, also the wife, but that was the ideal for Lucius. In case it wasn't clear, Lucius wanted this child to die. Yeah, this was very true of my first experience reading this book and my second, where it's just a part where the way Lucius describes this instance and rationalizes his own behavior is totally gross. This is irredeemable behavior to me. After all that, the miller divorces his wife, and she starts plotting revenge by means of sorcery. She conspires with a village witch to conjure an evil spirit who will take her husband, hang him, and drag his soul to Tartarus. After his death, the miller's daughter returns from her own married life in a nearby town to execute the will, and she auctions Lucius off to an old farmer. So it is winter now, and Lucius is barred from the human comforts of crackling fires and thick, soft mattresses. Not that either of these are at hand for his poor master, who lives in a small thatched hut and shares the very same diet of rotten lettuce with his donkey. One day, a traveling proprietor who had become lost stops at the hut, seeking shelter with his horse. The farmer's welcome is modest but warm, and the proprietor promises him corn, oil, and wine in his gratitude. The farmer loads Lucius with some baskets and wineskins and drives him to the proprietor's estate to collect the bounty, but a series of evil omens takes place before they can receive their reward. At this point, a slave relates to the proprietor some unfortunate news of his 3 grown sons. They had recently become involved in a dispute involving one of their friends, who is another poor farmer, and a wealthy, arrogant young landowner, who sicks his attack dogs on them, killing one and spears another himself. The last brother survives this encounter and even manages to kill his rival, but then sadly cuts his own throat in front of the crowd that has gathered to watch the fight. The proprietor is so horrified by this that he takes a cheese knife from the table and ends his own life in the same manner. On the way home, Lucius and his master meet a hostile Roman legionary who questions them about where they are going and tries to confiscate Lucius. The farmer doesn't speak Latin and ignores him, So the legionary whacks him with a pole and repeats the question in Greek. Farmer tries to plead with him and explain how vile and lazy and diseased Lucius is. I wish one of these people would just entertain the slightest possibility that, whether it's from the farmer or from the auctioneer or from the stable hand or any number of Lucius's owners, that all of these things that they're saying about Lucius are actually kind of true. Like, he's not an asset to anyone who's handled him. Like, he basically brings his own misfortune wherever he goes and inflicts it on everyone he meets, but the legionary won't hear it. And the farmer, who is old but still strong, kneels down as if he's going to beg, but instead seizes the legionary, beats him up, and takes his sword. Lucius and his master then proceed to the next town to seek refuge with a friend, knowing that if they are caught, the farmer will probably be put to death. So he now lives in a chest, while Lucius is tied up and stored in the attic. The legionary's comrades are familiar with the farmer, and they know exactly where he's hiding, but they are unable to find the pair in the house, so they decide to lay siege to it. Indulging his own desire to be in everybody's business at the expense of others, as always, Lucius pokes his enormous ass head out of the attic window just as one of the legionary's comrades looks up and sees his shadow. So they seize Lucius, and they seize the farmer, who has been nothing but kind and gentle to him, and they lock him up, where Lucius and the reader must assume that he is executed. At this point, Lucius goes on another digression, and you'll forgive me if I'm losing my patience with these a little bit, but a woman falls in love with her stepson, and he rejects her, so she contrives to poison him, but her biological son drinks the poison by mistake. She still attempts to take revenge by blaming her son's death on her stepson, saying that he had killed her son for trying to stop him from assaulting her. This also turns the boy's father, the woman's husband, against him, and he brings his son to trial. The prosecution go back and forth for some time, but in the end, pretty much everybody is in favor of a brutal capital punishment. But the pharmacist in the village finally speaks up and says that one of the woman's slaves had solicited him for a poison. He mixed a sleeping potion instead. Hearing this, the father rushes to the tomb and finds his stepson alive and well, just waking up from a deep sleep. Now that the court knows that the evil stepmother's slave had been the one to procure the poison, they sentence the slave to crucifixion, and the woman is exiled. So now Lucius is sold from the legionaries to two brothers who are a cook and a pastry chef. As a perk of their respective jobs, the brothers often bring home leftovers, to which Lucius eagerly helps himself after his masters have gone to sleep. I also want to interject here and say that the hygiene in this book is revolting. Let's recall all those times where we hear about people like eating and sleeping and storing food right next to Lucius as if they live in a barnyard. Lucius has been established as a pretty unreliable narrator, so honestly my interpretation of this is not actually that everyone he meets is genuinely as laid back and temperate and kind to animals as they are hygienic, but rather that Lucius is embellishing his journey to make for a better story. He didn't actually see or do all of this. Anyway, the brothers get suspicious, but they don't connect the missing food with the hungry pack animal that they keep right next to the food that goes missing, so they brush it all off. Then they pick up on the fact that Lucius has been gaining a little weight, and that the piles of hay in his stall have been lying untouched. Luckily, rather than beating it all out of him, they both laugh at how they came to own such a connoisseur of a donkey. The brothers' boss hears the laughter and is so amused himself by the story that he actually invites Lucius into the human triclinium, the human dining room, to eat with him every night. The boss, whose name is Theseus, is a Corinthian known for providing wild animals for gladiator shows in the region. And so on his next trip to Corinth, he brings Lucius with him as an attraction at the gladiator shows for his ability to eat, drink, and understand human speech, to which he responds by nodding his head. Among Lucius's new fan base is a wealthy and nobly born woman who becomes obsessed with him and will pay Theseus any amount of money for one night with Lucius. Theseus eagerly grants her the pleasure, which, although Lucius mentions his own desire for the woman in another startlingly candid, if not in this case actually graphic manner. Let's also remember she doesn't know that he's a human trapped in a donkey's body. So the woman is unsatisfied with just one night and soon returns to Theseus, offering more money. Theseus is also overjoyed not only at this novel stream of income, but also to have discovered Lucius's acquiescence to human partners. And so he decides to make a public spectacle of it. He selects a criminal who has been condemned to the beast for killing her brother-in-law and other members of her family and household, which includes her own daughter. Lucius is loath to defile himself with such activities and such partners, but he takes comfort in the return of spring and the budding roses that will soon return him to full humanity. On the day of the games, Lucius describes a short and somewhat vulgar play about the judgment of Paris, which leads him to a moderately unhinged tangent about judicial corruption, and I'm just done. I'm not going to try and make any sense out of this. He continues to dwell on his fear and anticipation at his immediate fate, which soon begins to grow mortal as it occurs to him that the game officials may plan to release some wild beasts on the odd couple while in flagrante delicto. Lucius panics, and having been kept under loose guard because of his tameness, they run for it all the way to the city Cancreae. Now we are almost at the end of the book, so please sit tight. Lucius goes to sleep on the seashore and wakes up at midnight, so he wades into the Sardonic Gulf to pray. He addresses his prayer to various goddesses, Ceres, Venus, Diana, and Proserpina, and appeals to each of them individually. He goes back to sleep and rises again to a wonderful vision. A goddess rises from the surf wearing a black tasseled mantle embroidered with stars and a dress of all colors constantly shifting from one to the next. She wears her curly hair long and crowned with flowers, corn, vipers, and a moon disk. She holds a sistrum in her right hand, a jug in her left hand, and she graciously answers his prayer. She is known by many names among all people of the world and honored by everyone, but her true name is Queen Isis. Isis tells Lucius that the newly dawning day is one sacred to her, and her priest will be leading a procession. Lucius is to meet the head priest, who will be carrying a sistrum wrapped in roses, and to eat the roses from his hand. In return for her benevolence and her protection, Lucius must now promise to devote the rest of his life to the goddess. As a side note about Apuleius' language, to which we will return very shortly, I really actually like this passage a lot, and I think it was one of the most beautiful parts of the book to read. So Lucius makes his way back to civilization to watch the parade, which starts with some revelers in costume, then some choirs and performers before the cult initiates arrive, carrying sacred objects and icons of the Egyptian gods. Isis has already informed her followers of Lucius, and they make way for him to approach the head priest. With his heart in his donkey throat, Lucius snarfs down the rose and transforms before everybody's eyes back into a human man. He knows that he is naked and standing with his legs crossed, hands in front of his groin like a cartoon character who just got pants. So the worshippers robe him in their own outer clothing, and the head priest addresses Lucius, releasing him from Fortuna's cruelty and welcoming him into their number. Tale of these events spreads far and wide, eventually reaching Lucius's friends and family, who rush to meet him and hear about everything that has happened. He also recovers his horse and the slaves that he had brought to Havete. In the meantime, even though Lucius devoted himself to meditation, he hasn't actually been formally initiated into Isis's cult just yet, hesitant as you might expect to embrace such virtues as moderation and chastity. Isis appears to him and says that his day of initiation is not far off, and that she wishes him to receive the rites from her own high priest. All of this comes to pass, though of course Lucius is sworn to secrecy, and he can't relate any of the details. After officially consecrating himself, Lucius sets sail for Rome, a year after the beginning of his unfortunate adventure. Here he also desires to join the cult of Osiris, and has another divine vision in which an old man carrying a staff wound with ivy offers him a banquet. Lucius remembers the man because of a deformity on his left ankle, and once he wakes, he is able to identify him as one named Asinius Marcellus, which Lucius takes as a sign given his recent transformation. Sure enough, Marcellus is the one who will initiate Lucius a second time into the cult of Osiris, But meanwhile, Lucius has been struggling to adjust to the cost of life in Rome. He sells off most of his possessions, shaves his head, and goes vegetarian in preparation for the rites, during which time he is able to recover some of his losses by working as an advocate in the Roman courts. But Osiris appears to him and says that he must be initiated for a third time. Lucius shakes off his doubts and eagerly fasts and shaves again, even exceeding the mandatory 10-day period in excitement, and thereafter enjoys huge, sparkling success as a bald lawyer in Rome and as a member of Osiris and Isis's most secretive and highest order,
the Pastafori.
And that is the end. If you need to take a moment, please do. In the next section, we will be discussing the text more abstractly, and so if you still don't have the exact plot straight in your head, please don't worry, this will not be on the quiz. Because of some references to his Apologia, a criminal defense speech he delivered against charges of witchcraft around 158 CE, we can assume that the Golden Ass was written at some point following that. And there is lingering debate over whether this makes The Golden Ass the first complete and surviving novel, a distinction many people give to The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu, which was written very nearly 1,000 years later on the basis that Greek and Roman novels were missing some integral characteristic that we find in the genre today. Personally, I don't really buy into this. I think even The Tale of Genji doesn't really stack up entirely against a modern novel, for example, in the fact that it has no sustained plot, and I do think that The Golden Ass fits the current popular conception of a novel as any substantial work of narrative prose fiction. Regardless, The Golden Ass almost certainly predates every other surviving classical novel except the Satirica or the Satyricon by Petronius Arbiter, which was probably not widely read or distributed enough in antiquity to have any definitive influence on Apuleius' work. However, the two novels do share similarities, particularly the use of Milesian tales. A Milesian tale is a short story with a humorous erotic character. Think of The Widow of Ephesus, or The Pergamene Boy in Petronius, and The Tale of the Wife's Jar, or The Tale of the Fuller's Wife in Apuleius. Among similar versions of the story type, this device is almost exclusive to The Golden Ass, and Apuleius actually introduces the entire novel thusly.
Now I will weave together different stories in that Milesian style for you, and please your friendly ears with charming gossip. Do not scorn the notion of reading an Egyptian papyrus, written with the sharpness of a Nile reed, that you may marvel at the forms and fortunes of men turned into others and return to their own conditions.
While admittedly these fables tend to overwhelm his own storytelling, Lucius maintains a very consistent narrative voice throughout, particularly through his near-constant moralizing. Cupid and Psyche is a kind of Milesian tale as well, but it is on the tamer, more solemn side compared to Apuleius' other offerings, and is probably actually a translation of a Greek original lifted from another text. But because of its references to philosophy, mysteries, and cults, Cupid and Psyche overall merits a more serious treatment. But while it lacks the lighthearted tone of other Milesian tales, Apuleius' version is overtly focused on the rewards of sexual love, which is of imminent concern to Charite, who stands in danger of assault and exploitation from the robbers. The story additionally references ideas about love and the soul that appear in Plato's Symposium and Phaedrus, the former of which is also a consistent reference in the Satyricon. Psyche means soul, and the story has often been interpreted as a metaphor for the soul's ascension into immortality through love. And while Apuleius was a Platonic philosopher, his other Milesian tales provided him additional opportunities to address looming themes in his own life as well as in the novel. The Golden Ass and the Satyricon also both belong to the tradition of the picaresque novel, a genre involving an episodic plot that sees a roguish, morally compromised but magnetic hero wandering from one adventure to the next. We might observe particularly close parallels between Lucius and Encolpius, the narrator of the Satyricon, as two young, handsome, educated, and presumably well-born young men who end up as outcasts from society because of their own stupidity. Even the protagonists of Greek romances like Leucippe and Cleitophon by Achilles Tatius or Daphnis and Chloe by Longus often have a similar humorous lack of sensitivity to their own flaws, which the writers use for comedic effect, such as Cleitophon's gullibility and cowardice or Daphnis and Chloe's sexual ignorance. In addition to its frequent digressions of the Milesian variety, The Golden Ass reflects many other shared traits among classical novels, such as the appearances of bandits and robbers, separated and reunited lovers, and the role of fortune in human life. This brings us to a more thorough situation of Apuleius within the Greek and Roman literary tradition. I just mentioned two of the surviving Greek novels, Leucippe and Cleitophon and Daphnis and Chloe, which scholars have traditionally separated as Greek romances from other prose fiction such as the writings of Lucian, which we mentioned earlier. Our surviving works in the genre tend to appear around the 2nd century CE onwards, but both Apuleius and Petronius were likely influenced by Greek models. The Golden Ass provides a thorough catalog of the essential Greek romance tropes, whether concrete story beats and character types or abstract themes. One of the most apparent is Apuleius' emphasis on the goddess Fortuna, who is the personification of fortune. If there is a single antagonist in The Golden Ass, it is probably fate. At the end of the book, Lucius's conversion also shows control of his life being placed into Isis's hands from Fortuna's. Fortuna intervenes in many romantic heroes' lives, usually just at the point when they think all of their problems are over, and there are many times in The Golden Ass where Lucius is just about to bite down on a rose before being startled or chased away. We can also see the role of fate in how the smallest actions that Lucius takes, such as leaning out of a window at the wrong time, can have far-reaching consequences. Minor villains like robbers and criminals are also a constant in The Golden Ass, much like other Greek romances, and while Lucius himself doesn't enjoy a romantic subplot, he does get to witness the story of Cupid and Psyche, and the ultimately tragic one of Charite and Tlepolemus. The novel in antiquity was also just as much of an invitation to fantasy as today, and could whisk you away to anywhere you've dreamed of visiting, whether that's sunny and glamorous Phoenicia, Ethiopia glittering with gold and treasure, or a warm autumn evening on Lesbos celebrating the season's vintage. For its part, The Golden Ass evokes the Roman fixation on Egypt through Apuleius' choice of savior for his hero, which according to Kenny is reason to take his representation of Isis's cult with a grain of salt. While Apuleius was from North Africa and initiated into several religious cults, he never settled in Egypt, and there's no evidence that he ever worshipped Isis or Osiris specifically, although faith and philosophy were important parts of his life. Nevertheless, he does show a real familiarity and even intimacy with Isis's rituals. His language is just as reverent, vivid, and caring as you would expect from a devotee, somebody who really trusted this goddess and this institution with their life. Elizabeth Hype proposes in her book Apuleius and His Influence that although Apuleius did not worship Isis specifically, this episode might retell a version of his spiritual awakening nonetheless. She also tentatively suggests that the novel as a whole may be a metaphor for religious salvation, and Lucius's donkey form represents humanity trapped within their animal urges, from which they can only be released through faith. So as notorious as The Golden Ass is for its comprehensive portrayal of and extensive moralizing on the subject of sexual deviance, the role of religion and attention to proper respect for the gods is also an important aspect of Lucius's moral stance as the narrator. Kenny noted that the protagonist's religious conversion only appears in Apuleius' version of the story, as does Cupid and Psyche, most of the Milesian tales, and the references to witchcraft. And I feel like I can't overstate how important that is to understanding the Golden Ass within the context of Apuleius' life. There are heavy religious themes and implications throughout the book, and Lucius himself is very concerned with how other characters use and express their spirituality, becoming particularly outraged at characters like the eunuch priests and the miller's wife who pervert religion for their own selfish ends. There's no particular blasphemy that Lucius attaches to the practice of witchcraft itself, but he does object when he observes people using it without proper respect for the gods. While Lucius was transformed through magic, he only manages to break the spell by appealing to traditional spirituality. He never really learns how to use magic, but once he's human again, he doesn't need to, and he has gained absolutely nothing beneficial from his little experimentation. Lucius also often concerns himself with policing gender roles in the novel, not just for the female characters, but for the male ones too. The priests are a good example of this. Lucius keeps coming back to how unnatural and perverse they are, as eunuchs who express religious devotion, feigned religious devotion through traditionally feminine acts like wearing makeup and colorful, elaborate clothing. The priests are additionally totally uninhibited from expressing any emotion or desire in public, particularly through their rituals that involve frenetic dancing, brandishing weapons, and panting with religious ecstasy, which we often see in female worshippers such as Bacchantes. While these priests would already not really be seen as men if they had been castrated, and it's still debated among scholars of whether we should define them as men, these performances distance them even further from the model of the Roman male. Don't get me wrong, Roman women had extremely strict morals to adhere to and were expected to be complete masters of their minds and bodies, but nevertheless, men stereotyped women, especially in literature, as driven only by their basest urges to drink and have sex, and maybe eat or menstruate a little if the first two are off the table. And this also applies to the priests, who do not really worship their goddess, but worship money, which they spend on food, wine, and luring young men into sex. Take note, however, that Lucius doesn't particularly object to male sexual violence when it affirms a man's status and authority, such as with the miller or with the robbers from earlier, in the latter case being much more disgusted with Charité's feigned submission. Nor does he object to women like Psyche and Platina assuming manly traits, and in Platina's case, even passing as a man, although he does separate this from and contrast it with their feminine natures. Combined with their flamboyant emotional expression and lack of care for the ideal of virtus, even in public view, the priests illustrate Roman misogynistic anxieties just as well as the women of the story. And to that point, I feel like even if you don't know a lot about Roman society, I think it's pretty clear the impression you're supposed to get of the women in the Golden Ass and the kind of character types they have and the things they do. So a lot of those fears and portrayals of women have never changed, so I'm just going to let those speak for themselves. Lucius admits he dislikes women in the very beginning when Charité feigns excitement when the robber suggests selling her to a brothel, and he appoints himself the judge of what he calls the species or the race of women and their morals. At least to me, Apuleius seems at this point to represent Lucius's misogyny ironically, considering the character's own loose morality and his lowly status as a donkey passing judgment on humans. And despite all this seeking salvation at the end of the novel, Lucius only appeals to goddesses. And the one who answers, Isis, is a custodian of femininity, fecundity, and female sexual power. Lucius's search for divine intervention at the hands of female deities actually closely and intentionally mirrors Psyche's. This myth itself is ripe for feminist retellings, and is certainly driven by Psyche's own initiative as well as her love and desire for Cupid, but it's important to remember that she doesn't consent to her marriage at first, and she's also afraid of her husband and thinks that he is a monster, so let's not go all lore Olympus on it yet. The purpose of the story in its narrative context is to soothe Charité's fears about losing her sexual autonomy by suggesting that a woman's devotion and submission will be rewarded. That's the message. Now, to move on to the finer and hopefully lighter points, Apuleius' language is very distinctive and original throughout the novel, which Monica Longobardi, citing a study by Laura Nicolini, attributes to the fact that Apuleius was Numidian and probably grew up speaking a Punic or Punic language before he learned Greek or Latin. While we have a less thorough knowledge of what that might have looked and sounded like, Apuleius' polyglottism lent him a unique inventiveness and flexibility. Apuleius uses extensive and specific wordplay that is an exercise in creativity for the translator. For example, the scene in which Lucius attempts to call for help on behalf of the priest's prey hinges on the similarity between the long O sound in a donkey's braying and in poro quirites. I think Robert Graves in his translation does this especially well, using the phrase he-whore, which is similar to the onomatopoeic English word for a donkey's brain. And Kenny maintains the long O sound by saying Romans to the rescue, which is a little bit hilarious. And Longobardi also makes note of Apuleius' fondness for palindromes and anagrams, which, because of the variety of word endings in Latin, are often much more varied and much more complex than in a lot of living languages today. In Gray's edition, he also addresses some of the accusations that Apuleius just plagiarized Lucian by contrasting the opening chapters of both books. And while they are narratively similar, the two could hardly be more different stylistically. Lucian is a great writer and working through his true story right now and enjoying it so far, but he is much more matter-of-fact than Apuleius. While it is fanciful most of the time, subtly boasting Apuleius and Lucius's educated status, the tone remains conversational throughout. This can give us an insight into the relaxed speech of the time, and I think it can also be an interesting glimpse into how people in the provinces might have combined Greek and Latin with their native languages. Pretty much all classical literature was meant to be spoken, even if the reader was alone, and Lucius would have been a very entertaining companion for a long afternoon or a late night. Apuleius' language also belies an acute genre awareness, such as when, during Cupid and Psyche, he says that the Milesian Apollo, in consideration for the writers of a Milesian tale, replied in Latin rather than Greek. I do find it really interesting how it's so common among Greek and Latin authors to be engaging with such a variety of references from existing works that we know nothing about. As we discussed, even though The Golden Ass is one of the earliest surviving novels from antiquity, it's already interacting with all of these established tropes that readers would be familiar with. As for my personal opinion overall, it's unfavorable, and please hear me out because when I first read The Golden Ass, I was fully expecting to just love it. This was right after I really got into Latin literature, so I was like 14, and I was interested in novels because I had just read the Satyricon and really enjoyed it, and I like really disliked it. So this is actually the first time that I've ever reread it since then, and I did want to revisit the book because I just enjoyed the movie so much, and also now that I've been studying Latin for longer and I can read a little bit in the original language.
And I should add that that was a major reason for my new appreciation of the novel.
So even though I didn't read the entire thing in Latin, the parts that I did read for this video I really enjoyed. I think Apuleius is a highly accomplished writer, and I really admire the way he uses the language. We'll talk more about his reception later in the video, but I think you can really see how uniquely flexible and kind of cosmopolitan Latin was at this time, where there's such a rich combination of vocabulary and syntax from all these different eras and cultures and dialects, and I feel like it's kind of a loss to the canon that Apuleius wasn't really widely read or accepted until so much later than a lot of other classical authors. With that said, I still could not really savor reading The Golden Ass a second time. Lucius is an insufferable narrator, and absolutely none of his little stories have the slightest touch of any levity or any charm. The way I would describe it is kind of like if the Satyricon were narrated by Lycus. I hope that helps some of you. But yeah, like as absurd as the events are, there's so much moralizing and editorializing on absolutely everything. The little play that he watches is a good example of this because it's so inconsequential, and yet he just starts talking about like the legal system, judicial corruption, like just because the court case that he was involved with was corrupt, and I was like, such a waste of space, and everything that he said was so banal. It wasn't even as if you can say like Lucius going off on this tangent shows how pretentious and out of touch his character is. It was nothing like that. Lucius is never likable enough to care for, and I think if he had become as virtuous as, you know, Isis and Osiris thought he was, he would just show a lot more humanity and reflection when he's telling these stories. But he literally says that his experiences made him no wiser, he just became more widely informed. And he kind of like got to hear more gossip that he kind of enjoyed. If somebody put Lucius up for auction to me, and if I caught one glimpse into his beady little human eyes, I would send him to the glue factory, like prontissimo. I think there's this conception of Lucius by virtue of the text as a sexual degenerate, but he's not, and I wish he was, because that would give him one interesting characteristic, but he's just a prude and a hypocrite. And I agree with William Arrowsmith that his religious conversion is just a shallow and ham-fisted way of trying to salvage him and showing his development into a better person.
And even Kenny is unconvinced by this ending.
So to be generous, the uncritical reader could argue that Lucius's conversion isn't the point of the ending, it's like just putting a bow on the story, but looking at the personal context as well as the tonal shift and the amount of detail, this is a very meaningful and intentional choice. And if Apuleius wanted to get his stupid book over with, Lucius would go to sleep and he would wake up in a bed of roses. But he has to be a priest. Lucius was redeemed, joined the Pasiphae, and didn't have to change a thing about himself fundamentally. As for the satire argument, The Golden Ass is just far too blunt, in my opinion, to be a satire.
Kenny also addresses this so-called argument in his translation.
It feels much like a lot of sitcoms you'll see today, where they will bring up these atrocious words and deeds and then have one like token morally virtuous character to correct whatever's going on and tell you what's actually righteous and what you should believe is like good. And then they'll call that satire. That is lampshading, and it has no place in media from any time period. True, some parts are clearly ironic, and I think if Apuleius had pushed that kind of voice even further, it could have been a really fun and entertaining book about this story that some douchey, dislikable guy is telling you. But because of his personal investment, I think that held him back in a lot of ways, because it's just so evident that he needs the ending to be sincere. And not just sincere, but literally like courting our sympathy as readers for his own legal plight, as well as Lucius's torments. And that truly curdles the entire story. Now, as excruciating as The Golden Ass may be, nobody can say that it's boring. I don't like reading this book, but we're like an hour, maybe an hour and a half into the video, and obviously if I hate The Golden Ass, the end was like the only thing I had to say about it, I wouldn't be making this. The entire history of the novel is so fascinating, and beyond that, Apuleius has quite the gift for pacing that never leaves any events or ideas to stagnate before moving on to the next. I think part of this is due to some of the themes of the work, which rely on the intervention of fortune, and so the constant changes in setting and circumstances help underscore that point. But I also found that I was just more invested in what actually happened next than in many other ancient novels, for example, Daphnis and Chloe, where I found the characters more sympathetic, but not necessarily interesting enough to carry my investment in the plot. I think that might have also been why that ending bothered me so much, because this was a book where I felt like I had no idea what was really going to come next and what was going to happen to Lucius. I think especially because it's a little more of an obscure text, it's like there are no spoilers for it. And I think with a different ending, even that could have made a big difference in my experience reading this book. And then, of course, Apuleius's striking style and use of language is really the cherry on top. The Golden Ass is undoubtedly one of the most enigmatic ancient texts that survives from any era of any culture, and that makes it even more intriguing as our only example of an intact Roman novel, which I think is a good place to turn the page to our next chapter. So now that we know all about The Golden Ass as a novel, let's talk about how the book survived late antiquity, made it through the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, and into the modern day. This is where I will really have to streamline and simplify things, and in my research I had to pick through just a lot of the potential implications and references that one can connect to Apuleius and his work. So just in case it bears repeating, this is not like a comprehensive survey, and the sources are in the description for you to check those out as well. Back to the plot. I was being a little bit mean when I said in my last video that the Golden Ass was a flop that had no cultural impact. The very well-known tale concerning Cupid and Psyche is profoundly influential and remains so, and literary landmarks like Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream and Kafka's Metamorphosis trace their inspirations back to the Golden Ass. But it wasn't always like this. Like many classical texts, the Golden Ass fell into obscurity after the decline of the Western Roman Empire, while the monasteries charged with the remaining copies treasured it mostly for one isolated episode, Cupid and Psyche. Scholars could easily remove that story from its larger context within the novel, which, unlike Cupid and Psyche, lacked such clear philosophical and moral messaging. Looks can be deceiving, but at first glance, Apuleius does appear to have little purpose beyond pure entertainment and fantasy as the needle on his moral compass spins around from chapter to chapter and page to page. Of course, Cupid and Psyche deals with one of the most enduring themes ever, but it also very easily lends itself to extended metaphors on other subjects. And because most learning took place in monasteries, this episode also remained highly relevant in a Christian context because of the emphasis that Christian spirituality places on the soul and the soul's union with God. I should note, however, that unlike Elizabeth Hyde proposed in our earlier sections, a lot of early Christian writers disapproved of a more generous religious interpretation of Apuleius' writing, and specifically disapproved of any conflation between the miracles that take place in the Golden Ass and those that take place at the hands of somebody like Jesus Christ. Whether you like the Golden Ass or not, we are fortunate to have any Roman novel survive the Middle Ages intact. But of course, and perhaps contrary to popular belief, this doesn't mean that storytelling and fiction writing suffered at all during this period. In fact, the popularity of folk tales and written narratives by authors like Nigellus and Chaucer probably sustained interest in preserving the Golden Ass in its entirety. It's also during these early years of the dawning millennium that a genre of Apuleian scholarship emerged. These scholars, who again were mostly monks or clergy, were also those who first attached the praenomen Lucius to Apuleius, whose real first name is unknown, and that has pretty much stuck around ever since. Also, as I mentioned earlier, this is when we start seeing the Golden Ass referred to by that title, which is a reference to its situation within the writings of Lucian and Lucius of Patrae, who also wrote versions of the story, but because Apuleius's is considered the best, it has the most little Milesian tales, it has the most philosophical significance, it's received the distinction of being the Golden Ass. These scholars soon began reviewing Apuleius's entire bibliography to better assess his writing. He wasn't exactly Virgil, but Apuleius was still mostly known for his poetry in addition to his philosophical works, especially for quoting and compiling material from other authors. So early medieval writers were aware of Apuleius' importance to the canon, regardless of if they could always make sense of him. But if you count yourself an Apuleius fan, the guy you should thank is Giovanni Boccaccio. Boccaccio stands alongside Dante and Petrarch as an instigator of the Renaissance revival of classical traditions in Western Europe. His book, The Decameron, liberally borrows and retells many stories from the Golden Ass in a contemporary context under the shadow of the Black Plague. In Boccaccio's work, dated to about 1350, a group of young Florentine women fleeing the plague-ridden city encounter a group of young men who have had the same idea. The women invite the men to spend 10 days in quarantine with them in a villa in the countryside where they entertain each other by telling stories. While their stories tread similar ground, the Decameron also introduces heavy Catholic themes, which, unlike Apuleius and his incongruously sincere conversion, parody the corruption and degeneracy of the medieval church. One only needs to make it to the very second story in the book, in which a Jew, having gone to Rome and been so impressed by the debauchery of the clergy, converts to Christianity, believing it to be the one true word of God if it can still boast followers despite such a debased and incompetent leadership.
Actually, you only need to make it to the first story, which is about two monks having secret sex with the same girl in order to hide their affairs, but I found the second one more of a fresh take.
The Decameron is a seminal text in Italian literature and received its own adaptation, this one much more famous and beloved by Pier Paolo Pasolini, around the same time as The Golden Ass.
So there's a lot of background noise in the next section, like more than usual, and I had to add some music, so sorry about that.
So thanks to Boccaccio, public appetite increased for Apuleius' works in their entirety, and eager readers recognized him as an accomplished writer and storyteller in his own right. According to Clementina Marsico's assessment of Apuleius in 15th century Italian literature, although his influence is often overstated, this interest contributed to a linguistic revival in which writers looked to his work for a model of composing texts in Latin. The state of the Latin language was highly fluid at this point, and it was read, used, and pronounced differently throughout its range in Western Europe. Cicero and Quintilian were the role models in Latin anthologies, and Golden Age, which usually refers to Republican and early imperial authors, provided the most authoritative examples in books of grammar and dictionaries. Apuleius' language, especially the more stylized prose of the Golden Ass, was received with curiosity and caution as far as applying his voice to one's own work. He is separated from those classical authors by his choice of subject matter and genre, but also by potentially as much as 200 years. As a result, Apuleius applied common vocabulary with different shades of meaning, which led early Latin scholars like Lorenzo Valla to suggest that a semi-literate Apuleius did not really know what those words meant. Marsico identifies Niccolò Perotti as the first scholar to uphold Apuleius as a genuine master of Latin, and to widely use examples from his writing, including the Golden Ass, to illustrate a successful use of the language. Not for no reason, Apuleius was full of archaisms, Greek loanwords, wordplay, and neologisms, which are all difficult devices to use effectively, but very well worth taking the time to recognize and understand. But for some of Apuleius' later wealthy male European readers, his multicultural background was a major turnoff. Some only ignored his African origins and linguistic tendencies, but others vocally denounced them. The 17th century writer Pierre Daniel Huet had a particularly unfavorable view of the Golden Ass, which he sought to be of low artistic merit because of its ties to African and Asian literary traditions. Following Huet's writing, contemporary scholars continued to distance the Golden Ass from other classical literature in order to preserve what they saw as the generic and cultural integrity of the European novel. Of course, amid the Orientalism craze of later centuries, translators soon intentionally played up Apuleius' Eastern influence to appeal to the same audience that had devoured the freshly translated Thousand and One Nights. Luckily, these days Apuleius is well known as one of the most accomplished ancient African writers whose native language and culture shaped his work. The Golden Ass is by no means as exotic as some editions make it out to be, but nor can it be separated from its origins in the Milesian tale, the Egyptian religion, and the Numidian and Gaetulian mind of Apuleius. The Golden Ass is still widely read and loved in Italy centuries after its Renaissance days, but in the meantime also found adoring fans abroad, including William Shakespeare, Franz Kafka, and C.S. Lewis. Shakespeare pulled liberally from the novel for his comedy A Midsummer Night's Dream, in his tradition of looking to continental folklore and literature for inspiration. The play, which is one of his most iconic, is set in ancient Athens and follows two couples who fall prey to fairies after eloping. To resolve a marital quarrel between the fairy queen Titania and her husband Oberon,
A mischievous little Cupid-like rascal named Puck
causes
Titania
to fall in love with Bottom, a traveling actor who, due to a magical mishap, is unfortunately stuck with a donkey's head. Also a contender for the title of the first novel, Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes, draws on Apuleius' picaresque structure as well as his inventive and pervasive wordplay, and parallels the plot and philosophy of several episodes from The Golden Ass. Don Quixote is also very similar in terms of its impact as one of the texts that re-established long-form prose narratives written for the reader's entertainment in the literary mainstream. Probably one of the most notable Apuleius-derived works of modern literature, Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, gives a more serious treatment to the same setup of a man suddenly transformed into an undesirable animal. The Metamorphosis again investigates many philosophical themes and is also replete with gendered implications through the protagonist Gregor's relationship with his sister Greta. After Gregor wakes up to find himself trapped in the body of a huge insect, Greta is one of his only family members who shows him care and sympathy. However, she soon comes to resent her brother and her role as his caretaker and almost surrogate mother, and she eventually betrays him to the rest of the family. However, Cupid and Psyche is still probably one of the best known parts of the text to this day, and has really taken on a life of its own. My guess would be that there are probably more viewers who are familiar with Greek and Roman mythology and who have heard of Cupid and Psyche than there are those who know that story specifically comes from The Golden Ass. Over time, various sources have embellished additional details and significantly expanded on the original plot and cast. The 17th century Spanish dramatist Pedro Calderón de la Barca explored the story's religious themes in two plays in which Psyche's two sisters are more symbolically named and wed. The first, named Idolatry, is married to paganism. The second, named Synagogue, is married to Judaism, and Psyche, in one version named Will, remains a virgin. Kate is a character who tries to separate Psyche from her husband, who is called Amor, both his alternate name in Latin and the Spanish word for love, which also represents the Christian ideal of love. The French playwright Molière also wrote a very famous stage adaptation filled with musical and dance numbers, while German writers preferred epic poetry as a medium of exploring Apuleius' original story. The myth is additionally pervasive in visual art, and take this with a grain of salt because I didn't see it explicitly referenced in any of my sources except on a gallery label at the Courtauld Gallery in March 2022. Often, many of these works deal with gender roles and gender confusion, though perhaps in a different way from Apuleius' text, where both Cupid and Psyche appear as youthful and feminized figures. Cupid has long curly hair, pale and smooth skin, chubby breasts, and in some versions he may be wearing jewelry or feminine clothing, and this could be because of the changing beauty standards, especially during the Renaissance and Baroque eras, but the subject matter itself, which often shows Psyche at the moment of her discovery, also inverts common gender dynamics in European art and art history by showing a female subject unveiling and gazing at a male subject without his knowledge or consent. Even if you haven't heard the myth before, the story itself may sound familiar. Cupid and Psyche forms the basis for the popular Beauty and the Beast fairy tale, first documented in France by Gabrielle Suzanne Barbeau de Villeneuve, and which has since become a pervasive story type in folklore and media around the world. So that was a lot, but I hope it kind of filled you in a bit as to the kind of popular and literary canon to which The Golden Ass belongs, although I did really only scratch the surface of his legacy in storytelling and media to this day. So if you are still curious, again, please look at the sources. I also tried to add a bit of a recommended further reading section where I will mention all of the works referenced in this section and everything that I read in summary or in passing, as well as some things that I kind of had to cut for time. So if you want to see Apuleius' influence in action, please check those out. And we're halfway through the video at this point, so thank you for sticking with me. If you need to take a break, please do so. Please do whatever you need to do to be comfortable for the next section. Make sure you put your feet up, make sure your pillow is sitting right, grab some popcorn and your favorite drink, because maybe not the reason you're here, but the reason I'm here It's finally time to start the movie.
Processo a porte chiuse per fatti strani contro Lucius Apuleius, cittadino romano.
Verum astra, vetum bellum, reditimus ad macelum, organatem clamaverum, alma Roma cedandus. Heia, 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 barbaros.
Is the truth stranger than fiction?
Is it at least more funny than fiction? In Apuleius' case, I think so. The film L'Asinodoro, Processo per fatti strani contro Lucius Apuleius, cittadino romano, which again we will call L'Asinodoro, combines fact and fantasy, specifically Apuleius' real life and the real court case that he was subjected to with the Golden Ass, and emphasizes an autobiographical interpretation of the novel, which to this point I feel like I've kind of been glossing over that a lot, but now we will discuss it in a bit more detail. And while the movie does primarily handle Apuleius' most famous work, we'll need to take a look at some new names and places and get to know Apuleius a little more as a historical figure. So Apuleius, who is sometimes known posthumously as Lucius Apuleius or Apuleius Madarensis, was born in Madaris in the Roman province of Numidia and described himself as half Numidian and half Gaetulian, Gaetulia being a bordering province. Although Madaris was far away from the most widely known cultural centers of Rome, Athens, and Alexandria, it boasted a well-educated population and many schools. Apuleius, however, studied in Carthage before moving on to Rome and then Athens, where he immersed himself in Platonic philosophy. Also keen on religion, Apuleius traveled throughout Asia Minor and Egypt in pursuit of his passions, using his extensive education to make some money as a lawyer on the side. And yes, that's what Lucius did at the end of The Golden Ass. At some point, he was initiated into the Dionysian Mysteries, ordained a priest of Asclepius, and then eventually appointed head priest of the city of Carthage. Apuleius was not known to his contemporaries as a novelist, but primarily as an orator and a philosopher. With this background, one day during his travels, he fell sick around the city of Ea and was tended to in the house of a man named Sicinius Pontianus. Pontianus's mother, Pudentilla, was a wealthy widow who was planning on remarrying, who was in search of a new husband, and Pontianus encouraged Apuleius to get to know her a little better. After recovering and delivering a successful public oration in praise of Asclepius, Apuleius had also become popular around town in Ea and wished to settle there. He stayed another year in the city to weigh his options, and because both Apuleius and Pudentilla thought it would be best to wait until Pudentilla's youngest son, Pudens, had assumed the toga release to be formally engaged and married. And just as a cultural note so you can visualize all these characters accurately, in Apuleius' time, boys usually underwent this coming-of-age ritual at 14 or 15 rather than 16, so Pudens was very young. As rumors spread, however, Pudentilla's brother-in-law Aemilianus became swayed by his own brother-in-law and father-in-law to Pontianus, the notorious ex-actor Herennius Rufinus. Herennius had offered his daughter in marriage and even borrowed a large dowry under the assumption that Pontianus would inherit Pudentilla's wealth, and having been assured by a scam oracle that he would die shortly after the wedding, making Herennius and his daughter rich. Herennius persuaded Aemilianus to accuse Apuleius of having seduced Pudentilla through witchcraft, and even managed to win over Apuleius' friend Pontianus as well, though the latter unfortunately died before the case went to trial. Even that tragedy put no end to Herennius' greed, and he simply added Pontianus' murder to the list of evil doings on the part of Apuleius. Apuleius and Pudentilla conferred and decided to try and salvage the family by giving her sons gifts of real estate, slaves, livestock, wine, grain, fruit, and oil, all to no avail. None of her sons were placated by this offering, and Pudens, the youngest, even eventually went to go and live with his uncle Aemilianus, where under Herennius's loose guardianship, he is allowed to spend all day at brothels and gladiator training schools. And Herennius also buys him the toga, even though he is still too young and too immature for it. Pudentilla had her heart set on disowning him for this, but Apuleius finally manages to dissuade her only by threatening to break up. The Apologia is super juicy, and it may have taken close to 4 hours to deliver in full, even though the trial itself wrapped up in a clean 4 to 5 days. Yet, based on contemporary legal practices, it's likely that our records are nevertheless an accurate reflection of what was really said during the trial by a court stenographer. As a famous orator, Apuleius' speech also attracted scribes called exceptores, who attended in order to create transcripts of his defense, either for their own practice of rhetoric or to publish and sell for profit. In the Apologia, Apuleius defends himself by emphasizing that he had no financial interest in marrying Pudentilla, and he explains away the allegations as part of his philosophical and religious activities, and reveals the prosecution's own scheming and defamation that they had committed against him. Apuleius heavily emphasizes his religious involvement and his piety in order to plead his case, which would have been very effective since the proconsul who was overseeing the trial, Claudius Maximus, was also a very religious man, as well as a passionate admirer of Platonic philosophy. Initiation into the Dionysian mysteries was an especially important talking point, since those are very mysterious rites that only a select group of people were privileged to partake in. But the trial had already been going on for years in the court of Aean society, including some very distasteful public stunts. On one occasion, Herennius led Pontianus weeping through the forum, reading aloud, very selectively, a letter from Pudentilla in which she is scolding him in order to make it sound like instead she is genuinely accusing Apuleius of seducing her through magic. According to a dissertation by Thomas Nelson Winter, the Apologia serves not only to defend Apuleius' own character and dispute the charges at hand, but also to dismiss rumors that had already been circulating about his relationship. Winter also points out that Herennius had entered Pudens' name as the prosecution on court documents, and because Apuleius knew the accusations were based on petty personal hatred and gossip, neither party would end up actually being punished, although both witchcraft and making false accusations under these circumstances were capital offenses. By this point, Pudens was 17 or 18, which is still under 25, the age of Roman legal responsibility. So the stakes were fairly low, and Apuleius had the freedom to speak at such length against his accusers and truly comprehensively address everything they had been saying about him, as well as to air out all of their own personal defects and vices. By this point, Apuleius had been suffering under Herennius and his constant lies and drama for close to 2 years, and it had been eating away at his personal life, his career, and his relationship with Pudentilla. For him, more than absolutely anything else, this case was just an opportunity to expose his accusers as the real villains in the situation. So Pudentilla also appears in the movie, as well as Herennius, Claudius Maximus, and other characters from the Apologia. And of these, Pudentilla is one of the most fully realized in both works. She was a mature noblewoman, probably 39 or 40 years old, to Apuleius' roughly 24 at the time of the trial. She is known from the Apologia to be a kind, considerate, and temperate person, moved to passion and decisive action in defense of her husband, which she does with the fiercest devotion. However, we should keep in mind that this is Apuleius' own defense, and therefore it's not impossible that he is downplaying any financial reasons for courting Pudentilla or marrying her. But they do have things in common. Like our impression of Apuleius, Pudentilla also appears to have a strong sense of justice and morality, especially the value of filial piety, which has been outraged by her family, who have pretty much all turned against her, including her own brother-in-law and her own sons, who have turned to slandering her husband just for a chance at her fortune, because they want her money so badly at the cost of her happiness and the peace that they have been keeping as a family. And as far as I know, Apuleius and not Pudentilla bore the worst of the slander's burden, yet she was really willing to risk so much of her own reputation and her own status in order to defend him. When the trial finally began, the murder charge had been dropped, leaving witchcraft as the only formal accusation. This was the first strike against Herennius and his little group, since it was very unusual to drop such a serious charge very shortly before a trial began, and it suggests that they hadn't really prepared an argument and that they didn't have any actual evidence, which is very true of the other charges as well. Winter rightly points out that although Herennius, Aemilianus, and Pudens were calling Apuleius to trial, in fact they ended up as the defendants upon whom the burden of proof rests. They had absolutely no case and only the depth of their hatred for Apuleius to rely upon. Winter lists no fewer than 15 false claims that the prosecution entered into the record, and they relied on fabricated evidence to support these claims, including a forged letter supposedly from Apuleius, yet whose language is laughably at odds with everything we have seen from him, and especially what we see in the Golden Ass. Apuleius, by contrast, was eagerly awaiting the trial and hungry for both revenge and redemption. He could have easily brushed off the charges with a short defense, but decided to turn the script on its head, pursuing a ruthless campaign against his accusers and not leaving the stand until, as Winter says, they had been sufficiently roasted. He describes all of their plotting, all of the strategies Herennius used to manipulate public opinion, and he especially singles out Herennius. Herennius was a former actor. That was like a very scandalous position to be in, and according to Apuleius, he had also married an actress, and the pair had passed their own low morality onto their daughter, Pontianus's wife, and he also accused Herennius of turning his own house into a brothel from which he prostituted his wife. Apuleius mocks the charges and treats them as trivial, joking insults. Some scholars have suggested this to mean that he really was practicing magic in some way, which seems like an exceptionally dense reading of this. More likely, for obvious reasons, is Apuleius has a sense of humor. So all of these accusations have led to a sort of synthesis in the popular and the academic discourse of Apuleius with the character Lucius, hence the name Lucius Apuleius. When I was reading this background to the trial, what I saw was a combination of both the virtues that Apuleius wants the public to think that he possesses, as well as the false, slanderous accusations that his accusers wanted the public to believe as well. There is a redemption arc that somewhat reflects various experiences in Apuleius' real life, and there are also several representations of, I think, a few of the specific claims, like worshipping false gods, especially worshipping a statue. And I kind of wonder if Lucius's harsh reactions to a lot of these acts that he witnesses also reflect the judgment that Apuleius received when he was being subjected to these false claims. Lucius is not, in my opinion, a one-to-one analogy for Apuleius himself, but maybe it combines a kind of younger, more indulgent, and less thoughtful author avatar, yet with the puritanical, hypocritical, and draconian morality of Herennius, Aemilianus, and Pudens. That's why I feel like when we talked about Apuleius' representation of things like witchcraft and magic and sex, I really wanted to separate what Lucius is giving us versus like what Apuleius is giving us, because Lucius has no nuance. He only sees things in black and white, but that of course is not true about Apuleius. He's just choosing to present these themes in that very bleak morality. I do not have the knowledge and the experience of an Apuleian scholar to really fully elucidate and support my opinions on the subject, kind of in the way that I want to, but I do think that the author has made an attempt, a tedious and unfunny attempt in case it bears repeating, but really just an attempt to express his frustrations and deliver a final blow to his accusers, and therefore the protagonist embodies an assortment of traits from both sides of this trial that allow him to be both subject to our judgment and eventually to achieve the kind of moral, ethical superiority from which he can judge others. In the end, Apuleius was acquitted. I did not find any evidence of any further punishment. He eventually came out on top and renewed his career and his relations with Pudentilla to no further criticism, although he did still rate the Golden Ass, so he didn't come off looking that great. Anyway, the film opens with the prosecution discussing and presenting the outline of the details of the case. First, the accuser, Aurelio Rufinio, meets with his lawyer, who is assuring him they will win the case. It doesn't matter if magic is real or not. Apuleius will be put to death, Rufinio will become rich, and twice-widowed Pudentilla will marry him instead. This is a major addition to Rufinio's motive, even if it glosses over the familial drama in the real story. And one of the things I noticed is this movie picks up all kinds of random historical and fictional threads without ever resolving them, so sadly I have to warn you not to expect any real intrigue to come from this. The trial begins following this meeting under the supervision of the proconsul Claudio Massimo, with both Apuleio and Pudentilla prepared to speak in his defense. The prosecutor begins with the story of a witch named Psyche. Psyche is known to use her magic to prey on men and transform them into animals, often victimizing Roman soldiers, an imminent threat to the Roman Imperium. This raises the stakes for the prosecution, and it also introduces a tension between Apuleius, the native-born Numidian Gaetulian, and the Roman presence in his homeland. Next, we see a troop of legionaries patrolling the same desert where they mistake a caravan for a group of robbers and attack them, disemboweling a prize slave belonging to the group's leader Milone. The soldiers promise to compensate him for the loss and withdraw. In the meantime, Lucio and his friend
Aristomene are lost.
Ave. Che cosa hai detto? Ave Caesar, lunga vita all'imperatore.
As a note, there are pretty minimal differences between the characters' names in Latin, English, and Italian. So in this section, I will try to use the Italian names as they appear in the film. I may use one or the other depending on the context, just know they basically all refer to the same character.
Somehow while I was recording, I just forgot that Lucio's friend is named Aristomene and not Aristomene. I consistently mispronounce his name. I don't mean any disrespect towards him. I absolutely love that character, and I'm sorry it slipped my mind, but in some places I've tried to replace the audio, in some places it just wasn't going to work, so I have kept the original pronunciation, but it is Aristomene.
Aristomene has seriously been upgraded from a very minor character in the book to one of Lucio's consistent sidekicks, and it adds a really entertaining buddy comedy element to the film. The guys happen upon Milone seconds after the soldiers leave and introduce themselves as students and philosophers asking for help. Milone recognizes Lucio, apparently an old family friend, and eagerly invites the pair of them home. I like the transition here a lot. This is very good. Milone's wife Panfilia and her slave Fotide receive them hospitably, but despite his avuncular routine in the desert, the two friends are clearly an afterthought to Milone, which results in some fun jokes that reference his miserly disposition in the novel.
Fotide, la coppa dell'ospite. Sì, padrone.
Ma che fai? Li vuoi ubriacare? La coppa dell'ospite deve essere un simbolo. Basta un assaggio, che spreconi che siete.
At dinner, they settle in with Milone's household and rich friends, swapping jokes, stories, and libidinous glances. Lucio also takes note of the amount of animals hanging out around the house, whom Panfilia has a great fondness for, and finds himself intrigued by this woman.
Lo vedi? Si è innamorata di te.
Anche lei.
While Lucio catches Panfilia's eye, Aristomene catches that of a male guest named Mario. Milone at this point also refuses a cup of wine because the grapes are lesbian.
No, questi vini di Lesbo, così pervertiti, così contro natura.
And at Panfilia's invitation, Lucio happily drinks the lesbian wine over Milone's protests.
Bevi pure, Lucio. Non ti farà rimpiangere il vino di Lesbo.
I was also reading the menu at this dinner and it made me really hungry. Some of the food actually sounds really good. As the guests begin to loosen up, they urge Aristomene to get up and sing a song, so he composes a tune ex tempore, out of gratitude to Milone, and I'll just roll the clip.
Noi vorremmo regalar un dono tanto grande che più grande non ce l'ha all'immortata, l'immortalilli, dimmi lo canto, l'immortalità, all'immortata, l'immortalilli, doniamo a Milo l'immortalità.
Aristomene finishes his recital to dead silence, except for Milone, who rushes over to clasp his hands in admiration.
Sei un uomo spiritosissimo.
But Aristomene gives us a fun fourth wall break.
E di fame arretrata.
Again, unfooled by Milone's flattery. What follows is, in my opinion, one of the funniest shots I've ever seen.
Oh, Giove che caldo.
And because of the heat and the rich meal, the guests all retire soon afterwards. So just in these first few scenes of the movie, the dialogue is really interesting to me. It's very colloquial without being overly vulgar, which I think is a line a lot of historical films tend not to draw. And the plain 70s Italian being spoken by people in togas is just really entertaining. Something about the way Lucio says this line especially is just like working. It's like working. It's working so hard. I love it.
Cos'è, un amico geloso? Un ex?
It does piss me off sometimes when media just like uses modern slang, which is usually like misused too, just for kind of like cheap entertainment and just to carry the entire comedy of the work, because it's not just like the contrast is inherently funny, it's like the dialogue also has to be well crafted and engaging. The camera is also just so smooth in this scene. It feels like voyeuristic. It follows each character around without really confronting them,
As if you were really present.
paying attention to what's happening around you, but not really trying to make full eye contact with any specific person. It looks so good. It's like buttery. And I think this kind of naturalistic style is the perfect approach to adopt to a story that's so based on a person's observations and things that he witnesses and that he overhears. But the desert heat isn't the only thing keeping Lucio and Aristomene awake that night. Each guy is snooping around for similar reasons. Lucio is hoping to get lucky with Panfilia, and Aristomene is after Fotide. Lucio is unsuccessful at first, but still fares better than Aristomene, who has some unfortunate encounters, first with Mario and then with a married guest whose husband is asleep beside her. While Lucio tries to get close to Panfilia, he unfortunately falls under a magical spell that transforms him into a Marvel character.
Accuccia, da uomo a cane, anzi, da uomo a uomo. Buono, Cornelio. Buono.
This sequence is definitely a highlight from the entire film, and it really underscores the chemistry and the characterization of the two leads, as well as the levity and personality that Spina and his writers and actors added to the story. I can't say anything for sure. I do not know how this movie was made, but I can see some of this being improv as well as scripted. It's so fluid and it feels so natural, and it does such a good job at showing us what these characters are like kind of as a pair and how they individually approach the same situation. In the book, Lucius can come off as overly serious, so it is nice to see him taken in the opposite direction, because let's remember, this is a guy whose deepest desire is to turn into a bird, and at this part, I was even kind of disappointed and a little nervous and like stressing out, because I liked Lucio a lot already and I didn't want to see him go on to make all of the terrible decisions that he does in the book. And I don't want to spoil it just yet, so I won't comment on that part at this point in the video, but you will see how that issue is resolved. For the time being, Lucio is still a very cool, like very chill character I would like to hang out with personally. I also enjoyed John Steiner's performance a lot, especially I think he has a very good comedic talent. Anyway, the closest Lucio manages to get to Pamphylia is face to face with her dog, who frightens him and he falls backwards into the impluvium. The dog's growling alerts Aristomene, and he hurries over to help Lucio out of the pool, while two legionaries materialize next to them and demand identification. Aristomene tries to get rid of the soldiers and the dog by meowing like a cat.
Documenta.
And while the soldiers are suspicious, they can't really arrest them for anything. It is very weird to be an adult man sneaking around at night meowing, but it's not like against the law per se. They didn't really cover that in the Lex Julia. So as they leave, the soldiers start arguing about the dog, and one insists that the local fables about men who were turned into animals by magic are all true. But on their way out, they leave the gates of the house open, and Pamphylia's dog and her cat run out into the street.
Lucio, ma che fai? Vieni giù, butta il gatto, cretino. Sbrigati, vai a chiudere il portone. Svelto. Vai.
As Lucio hurries to catch them, he accidentally lets the gate slam shut behind him, which locks him outside. Meanwhile, Aristomene, who has been knocked out, wakes up in Mario's bedroom as the soldiers pursue the lost animals outside. While they rush past, Lucio decides to try and climb up the wall and into the courtyard and makes his way onto the roof. Lucio decides that Aristomene's trick to meow at the soldiers was so successful he can probably try it himself and it will go fine, but as he is crouching on all fours, the soldiers mistake him for the runaway cat. Lucio almost escapes their suspicion, but he sneezes just as one of the soldiers peeks over the roof tiles and sees another grown man meowing on all fours, which confirms his suspicions about shape-shifting magic and knocks him off of the roof onto his ass.
Questa è pura magia.
Lucio is no more elegant. He topples over in the opposite direction and plunges back into the impluvium like a ton of bricks. Luckily, Fotide has also been looking for Lucio and Aristomene at Pamphylia's request, and she is there to haul Lucio out of the impluvium, save Aristomene from Mario's clutches, and deliver both of them to Pamphylia's room to begin a magic ritual. They're also all being loud as fuck right now.
Ah no, ne ho le scatole piene di cani, di gatti, di Fotide e Aristomene. Entrali dentro e sta buono.
Povero tesoro, sei bagnato come un pulcino.
Basta né gatti né pulcini.
So Pamphylia takes Lucio to bed, where the lighting is absolutely delectable, and then they have the most far-out sex scene ever. Meanwhile, the two soldiers have reported the strange occurrences from the evening to their commanding officer. The commanders are furious and they demand the dog and the cat to be brought in as evidence so that they can put an end to the practice of witchcraft in the city.
La mia vita sta diventando un incubo.
The soldiers run back to the villa and they seize both Lucio and Aristomene to be interrogated.
Voglio il mio leguleio. Avrai tutto il tempo.
Claudio Massimo, the proconsul, explains that he does not believe that magic exists and that Psyche is exaggerating her powers in order to intimidate him and undermine his authority and demoralize his troops. And he states that his mission is to liberate the province from her influence.
La magia è tutta un'invenzione di quella psiche per minare il morale delle nostre truppe. E se le truppe sono terrorizzate, rendono la metà. Lo vuoi capire? Sì, proconsole.
I'm just saying that so far there isn't a dull moment in this movie. The actors are chewing, the script is so tight, it's basically waterproof, and there's especially no wasted opportunity for physical comedy. Like, take the aforementioned proconsul's helmet and the commander sitting on the very edge of his chair because of it. It's funny and it tells you so much about each character's role individually within the plot and then also their dynamic with each other. This is also a great thing about film as a medium where you can add these details that would seem heavy-handed in writing. So while this is going on, the Legion has treated Lucio and Aristomene to a second dinner and lots of wine, and we see some more of their cute little mannerisms.
E tu ti lamenti dei romani? Guarda, amico, come trattano i prigionieri. Questa si chiama civiltà.
civiltà. Civiltà. Ben detto, ben detto.
The proconsul arrives and Lucio, totally sloshed, professes his admiration, while Aristomene addresses the camera again.
Per Giove, è il primo proconsole che vedo da vicino in vita mia.
This is another interesting thing about L'Asinodoro, where I think a lot of movies use fourth wall breaking to give characters a kind of omniscience, and they use this device to kind of represent the character's hindsight and their ability to reflect and engage with their past. Whereas here, whenever Lucio and Aristomene engage with the audience that way, they're still exactly the way they are in the moment, where it's like Aristomene is stupid and drunk at this point in his life, and that's the kind of guy he is when he's talking to us. He is commenting on the story, but not in a way that removes us from it or that removes him from it. And that's really interesting as a contrast to some of the voiceovers that we later get, which do provide a bit more of a reflective look at the plot, as well as the narration of the Golden Ass. So the proconsul responds in kind that Lucio's fame has carried far and wide over the empire. An admirer of Lucio's work, and believing the pair to be victims of Psyche's magic, pronounces them free and bids them a safe return to Milone's house. For protection, he lends them his swords, while Lucio pets the horsehair on his helmet. Sorry to keep drawing your attention to these tiny things, but also look how each of them hesitates to pick a sword and wants the other one to go first, and they're just staring blankly. My friends and I do this when we're sober. It's such a great detail to include in their relationship that makes it feel so much more real. So Lucio and Aristomene are off, leaning on each other and singing Aristomene's composition, which attracts the attention of a group of thieves nearby, and the thieves attack them. However, Lucio and Aristomene manage to clumsily fight them off, while Lucio is still singing of his love for Pamphylia. However, he is too drunk to stand back up after he falls during the altercation, and so Aristomene gives him a piggyback ride all the way home. Clotilde is elated that they are back so that she and Pamphylia can finally begin their ritual, but Lucio and Aristomene are completely exhausted and just conk out on the bed. Clotilde is so upset with Lucio for snoring like a donkey that she transforms him into one as he lies there. Pamphylia arrives and demands she turn him back, transforming Aristomene into a pig to match. Clotilde is not to be outdone and transforms Lucio into a wineskin, and Pamphylia responds by turning Aristomene into a straw man. After going back and forth like this, the women laugh, and Pamphylia allows Lucio to flutter around as a little bird before returning him to his human form. However, Clotilde is still angry at Aristomene, and she leaves a sea sponge in his throat that will choke him when he tries to eat. As Pamphylia whispers in the dozing Lucio's ear, she puts to him a question that will become an important motif for the rest of the film.
Sogno o realtà? Tu che cosa ne pensi, mio dolce filosofo?
The next morning, Lucio and Aristomene tack up and prepare to move on, having received their first taste of magic. They pass through the Roman ruins with townspeople driving carts and haggling over goods. I also thought this movie made a really good use of its setting. It was mostly filmed on location in Algeria, and obviously filming within Roman ruins is, I think, something that is either not allowed or much more strictly overseen now than it is then. And some people may criticize it because it's inaccurate to have these buildings already crumbling supposedly at the time when they were being used, but I do think it's an interesting use of the setting, and I like how it contributes to this new theme of the cultural conflict between Apuleius and the wider Roman tradition, as well as just flaunting the beauty and the character of the Algerian setting where Apuleius was born and raised. But while riding through these cobblestone streets, Lucio and Aristomene are recognized by the two soldiers, who run to get the centurion, and a squad of legionaries is soon on the case. After leaving the city, Lucio and Aristomene stop at an oasis to cool off. We get some more fun dialogue.
Guarda com'è ridotta.
Cosa?
Troppo leggera. Qui mi ci vorrebbe una lira pesante, come in Gallia. E poi è uno strumento poco valorizzato. Voglio lanciare una campagna in difesa della lira.
Lucio wades in, but Aristomene stays on the shore, where he begins choking on the sponge Photide had left in his body. Choking to death, Aristomene cuts his own throat. Please also be informed that this is based on a real story that Aristomene narrates in the Golden Ass. It wasn't something that happened to him, but between one of his friends named Socrates and a witch named Meroe. I omitted it from the book recap because I wanted to get into Lucius's transformation faster, but there's that. There are a few more stories from the very beginning of the Golden Ass that come back, and I will make sure to point those out as well. This was a difficult part to watch for me. I really liked Aristomene. It was sad to see him gone from the story so soon, and sad to see Lucio picking olives on the other side of the oasis. When the soldiers arrive and start questioning him, they name drop the metamorphoses, and they also accuse Lucio of killing Aristomene, which is how he learns that his friend has died. Lucio responds by evasively deadpanning, as he does during the trial, that he has also burned his grandmother alive and killed his son. The soldiers are unimpressed, and they arrest him for witchcraft and drag him back to the city. But as they progress, the soldier hauling Lucio along on a rope feels him growing heavier and heavier, and eventually looks back to find Lucio missing entirely with a donkey in his place. In the next scene, Lucio wakes up in his human form, lost on the outskirts of Havete. He stops to ask an old man where he is and why the city has been deserted.
Che paese è questo?
Epata, ma togliti, mi fai ombra.
The old man tells him everyone is locked up in their houses because they fear the local witches, and if he wants to know more, he should go to the town square. On his way, he overhears Rufinio making an announcement regarding the situation that a beloved citizen named Apollone has died, and his body and tomb are besieged by witches who plan on stealing his corpse. This story also does appear in the Golden Ass. It is narrated by a guest of Milo and not experienced personally by Lucius, but there is a kind of magic, grave robbery, changeling situation in the book as well. This is also where we get some background for Pudentilla, who is Apollone's widow, and she is offering a reward of 1,000 sesterces to anyone who will watch over the corpse for the entire night. But if any part of the body is found missing in the morning, the lazy guard will pay for it with the equivalent part taken from his own body. Lucio feels up for the challenge and the 1,000 sesterces, and Rufinio and his other local officials lead him into the tomb.
Udite, popolo, udite! Lo straniero ha accettato le condizioni e veglierà sul corpo del compianto Epulone. Avete detto di no alla fortuna e la dea bendata è stata ghermita da uno straniero.
Here there is a little awkward silence. Before the mourning women inside resume their lamentations, and we also finally meet Pudentilla here from behind a dark veil. She's weeping inconsolably and totally beside herself with grief at her husband's death and the fact that there are witches trying to steal his body, but toxic, manipulative Rufinio is there to reassure her. He offers some words of comfort and that Lucio will look after the corpse. Then Rufinio shushes everybody so that Pudentilla can deliver a little speech to Apollone, which involves awkwardly cataloging and describing every part of his body in detail.
Capelli. E adesso basta.
So that she will know if anything is stolen by the witches. Anyway, shortly after this, everybody deserts the tomb and leaves Lucio alone with Apollone's body. Pudentilla, however, returns not long afterwards and asks Lucio if everything is still in order. He tentatively affirms, and she finally unveils herself. Drawn to each other like magnets, they kiss and touch as a group of witches ride through the empty streets outside. Now, Pudentilla is actually in league with the witches, and she allows them to steal from Apuleius' body as she makes love to Lucio inside the tomb. And if you can tell me what the hell these special effects are supposed to be, I would appreciate it. I can tell it's supposed to represent like the witches sending some little avatar in to steal his passerotto, but I don't know what it's supposed to be, like what it's supposed to be shaped like. Is it a bird? Is it just like an abstract symbol? This, I would say, is not one of Bassinodoro's finer moments. Also, while the love scene here is very soft and beautiful, if a bit more literal than Lucio's with Pamphylia, there are also some really gross sound effects of the witches mutilating the body. And also at this point, I had to switch from the version I had been watching, which cuts off here, to a really poor quality version that's on YouTube. So this is where I ran into most of my issues with the audio and video quality, so I apologize that the clips I'm going to show moving forward probably will not be super clear. So please keep that in mind. That is kind of limiting to what I can really discuss and what I can show you. So Lucio wakes up the next morning alone in the tomb, and to his horror, he discovers that Pudentilla's beloved passerotto, her pet sparrow, is missing. He panics and takes some wax from some of the candles to crudely fashion one himself to stick onto the corpse. Rufinio, his officials, and the mourners all return, and Lucio can only stand there sweating in the corner waiting for his negligence to be discovered. With his mind racing, Lucio makes one unsuccessful attempt to ditch everybody behind before coming up with a new plan to just run really fast out of the city and throw himself over the walls before anybody can catch him and despoil him of his own sparrow. Lucio finds refuge in a nearby cave, but his peace of mind is cut short when he realizes he has trespassed into the witch's lair. A witch finally appears to confront him, repeating Pamphylia's important philosophical question.
Lucio Apuleius, di che ti stupisci? Ciò che è reale non è apparente e ciò che è apparente non è reale.
Which gives Lucio a spook. His tunic falls off. He starts running naked in the other direction, and as he runs, he feels his body changing and taking on a new form with much less confusing visual effects. Lucio's metamorphosis is incomplete, and he has turned into a donkey. The witch, meanwhile, has caught up to him and says this is the sad prize that he receives for his squandered youth spent in debauchery, but that he won't always be this way. Lucio runs out of the cave, or gallops out of the cave, and there is some good POV that we get from him through the camera being so shaky and lower to the ground, like donkey eye height.
In piena coscienza io non mi sentivo di condividere il duro giudizio di quella maga sulla china di una troppo dissipata giovinezza nella quale secondo lei sarei disceso. In realtà adesso andavo risalendo la china troppo erta di una montagnosa regione.
I really liked that, and I thought it was a really good addition to the voiceover in the scene, which from here going forward will be a much more frequent device. This is often when Lucio has something to say in his donkey form, just in the way he never shuts up. In the book, he's still very talkative in this movie, so we get a voiceover in which he expresses, I think more than anything, just kind of disagreements with the witches. Like, he does not think he deserves this punishment, but he's not especially outraged by it. He accepts that he is a donkey pretty quickly. And looking back, he is so much more calm about it in general than he was in the book. His transformation is also totally reframed as a punishment rather than an accident, which also foreshadows that at this point Lucio has made bad choices and has not always been a very good person who contributes interesting and helpful ideas and actions to society, but he is still capable of change. In fact, his fate depends on his own development. So we'll see if he decides to take the witch's words to heart. The next we see of Lucio, he has been captured from his wandering around the mountains and sold from owner to owner until he ends up in the hands of an old man who works in a mountain village as a pack animal. The old man leads him to his home where he is received by an old woman loudly shouting that her master has returned, her mistress's husband has returned, announcing his arrival, basically stalling for his wife, who is inside the house, throwing on her clothes and shoving her younger partner out of view. She leans out of the window and amicably receives her husband but denies him a kiss. He departs to unpack amidst some classic 70s sitcom humor.
Che tu possa cadere da cavallo e fracassarti il cranio. Ciao tesoro!
A stasera!
And in the meantime, Lucio has been put to work turning the millstone next to the couple's house. The wife smacks him a few times, and I thought it was really funny how we hear Lucio responding to these blows in a human voice. I think the miller's wife here is named Virena, which is a minor character in Havete whom Lucio meets and who I think is actually related to him. She's like his cousin or something in the book, and is the first to kind of clue him in that Pamphile is a witch. I do not think the miller gets a name in this adaptation. Virena's partner is terrified of her husband and fears that it is impossible for him to escape in time, so instead she hides him under the bed. The miller enters the room and throws himself onto the bed, where he begins to tell his wife about some gossip he heard around town of other women's indiscretions. I do not think the tale of the fuller's wife is fully explained here. It's not one of the longer Milesian tales in the book, but it is a little less satisfying. It's a pretty mundane story that doesn't fully get resolved. We don't really know what happens between the fuller and his wife because she doesn't get away with the affair, but he doesn't punish her for it. He doesn't leave her. He doesn't kill her. The lover, I think, is dead, but we don't even really know that for sure. Virena is, of course, not pleased with this direction that the conversation is taking, so she remarks on the pleasant weather they've been having and suggests that they continue to catch up outside. Then the miller reveals that he had been onto her from the very start and pulls the younger man out from under the bed. But Virena still tries to maintain her innocence by pretending to be frightened of the intruder. The miller isn't fooled. He tells her that he's only a young boy and that this whole thing can stay between the three of them, even as Virena actually totally throws him under the bus and urges the miller to kill him. So in the book, I mentioned the way Lucio is thinking is like strangely evil. Even for him, it was like you get to see his dark side in this passage, but this part of the movie just like cuts away. There isn't the same detail or attention given to it as in the novel. And the part that I just loved is that Lucio doesn't do it. Because it's like he's just watching through the window. You know, in the book, this family was disgusting and they had their stable next to their grain storage that was next to the dining room. I don't know if he would have if he could, but he couldn't, so he didn't step on the kid's fingers. So thanks to movie Lucius for not doing that much that was wrong. In the next scene, a fire has broken out at the mill that sets Lucio and the other animals free. A group of legionaries has arrived at the scene, but they are nowhere close to having anything under control, and one even says that the fire is so beautiful because it's destroying the Gaetulians.
La fiamma è bella! Distruggete questi sporchi geculi!
Nevertheless, one lucky soldier chases Lucius and is able to capture him and sell him to a theater troupe. So the next scene takes place at one of their shows, where we get a little comedic relief from the actor, writer, and gay icon Paolo Poli, playing a sexually ignorant Christian girl who marries a Roman but can only achieve climax when she is eaten by a lion in the arena, a worthy replacement for Apuleius' tasteless mythological reenactment. I wouldn't say the style of humor here really appeals to me, whether it's Paolo Poli or the other two actors who do a little comedy routine. They all attended acting school on the Franco and Ciccio scholarship.
I'm so dense, guys. It wasn't even supposed to be funny. They literally throw cabbages on stage after the play.
Also, as a small tangent, Paolo Poli wrote and acted in his own adaptation of The Golden Ass through his theater company, Poliscena, which you are welcome to watch if you are a stronger person than me.
Io sono l'ampolla sulla scia della magia, qualunque via so cacciar via.
Foley was a very beloved and renowned figure, and his stage adaptation also received probably more press than the original movie. I read a few little reviews and mentions of it in some of the newspapers I looked at, and it seemed like a lot of the critics weren't even aware that he had been in a film version of The Golden Ass before this. I did find Paolo Poli to be very charismatic. I did like that the scene kind of keeps the focus on plebeian life in the provinces, which is one of the most valuable kind of historical and anthropological aspects of the novel. A mock gladiator show follows the play, which I thought the two gladiators were kind of more funny. Finally, it's Lucio's turn in the spotlight. His handlers lead him on stage as a novelty, the Ass of Gold, who is docile and scholarly with the heart of a gentleman. They try to offer him human food and do another unfunny bit where Lucio tells the male handler that he'd rather have the woman handler instead of the food. Two rich ladies have been watching the show and adding their own fun little banter in between.
Povera figliola, oh, che orrore! Dopo l'esperienza con quella bestia di mio marito, guarda, t'assicuro, bestia per bestia preferisco quello.
The whole sequence is a little hard to watch for me. So this woman pays the actors 100 sesterces for the privilege of sexual congress with Lucio. During the scene, there's some Latin text that is an excerpt from the equivalent chapter in the novel, and it's kind of superimposed on the frame from the movie, which I think is an interesting way and not one I've seen tried before of kind of censoring a scene visually without either glossing over it entirely or even without removing any of its content or any of its impact, because if you do read Latin, you can just read this and you'll still know exactly what is going on. Of course, if you don't, he explains it in the next part, but this was an interesting choice to me. But even with his handler sworn to secrecy, the scandal is nevertheless soon discovered, and the noblewoman flees to Rome in disguise, leaving Lucio abandoned by his troop to wander through Gaetulia alone until he collapses. The scene is actually kind of sad to watch. It is like he doesn't make the choice to run away. He is deserted because his owners blamed him for some kind of scandal and like they think it will affect their livelihood. Okay, he's not as enthusiastic as he is in the book, or at least not as kind of graphically aroused by it, because this was another scene where there is more than a comfortable amount of detail, but it's also like you really know like his handlers do just see him as a donkey who has a taste for human food, for example. And yet they think that this is his fault and it doesn't have anything to do with the individual handler who accepted that woman's offer. Anything like that is like somehow they have to abandon him, you know. He doesn't run away of his own will. And so I think you really get a sense of his confusion and hopelessness in this scene. As he lies on the ground, he offers a prayer to Ceres, Proserpina, Isis, Venus, and Psyche to save him from his sorrow and make him human again.
Regina del cielo, sia che ti chiami Cerere, o Venere di Saffo che all'inizio del mondo desti vita all'amore, o Proserpina, o Iside, o Dea Psiche, maga di questi luoghi, Dea soccorrimi, cancella da me quest'orribile faccia da quadrupede, rendi Lucio al vero Lucio.
When he wakes up, he flexes his fingers and he raises his head to find the old Lucio back, lying naked in a field, and he jumps for joy and bounds across the horizon. How I would have loved to see this scene in 4K. Next, Lucio has been reunited with Pudentilla, whom he still loved and had been searching for since he became human, and they had been married in the meantime. Pudentilla reminds him not to let his past affect him in the present, and Lucio agrees but says that his experiences have given him so much inspiration, and he has so much to tell everybody through the medium of his poetry, but more than that, he has so much that he wants her to know. And this was also a huge change from the book, where Lucius doesn't really learn anything, and despite calling them metamorphoses, he doesn't see his experience as transformative or enlightening. It was entertaining and perhaps informative to a small extent, but here I think it already adds a lot more depth and significance by making it something that will impact Lucio's life in the trial, and that also impacts him in his creative and his personal life. So we are finally back to the main timeline in the courtroom. The lawyer lays out the charges of witchcraft, murder, and seduction, and requests the death penalty. Before Lucio can properly respond, Rufinio jumps in to point out that, thanks to his skill as a magician, just 4 months ago Lucio entered the city without a sestertius to his name, yet now he is rich, famous, and married to the wealthy and virtuous Pudentilla. He enters into evidence a scroll, which he claims to be a letter from Pudentilla to her brother-in-law, where she says she is a victim of Lucio's magic. He then even more boldly accuses Lucio of murdering Aristomene and calls the centurion to witness. The centurion takes a stand and explains how, when he arrested Lucio on that charge, he turned into a donkey and escaped, and both Lucio and his opposition have some funny reactions when they appear in frame. The lawyer announces that he has written evidence of this too, which he introduces as Lucio's diary. Lucio rolls his eyes and tells him it's nothing like a factual account. It's the opposite, a collection of Milesian tales that he plans to publish as his next book. The proconsul gets annoyed with all this, and he dismisses both the centurion and the evidence. As if things can't get more ridiculous, outside the courtroom a cat meows, and Lucio stands up saying that he would like to call the cat as a witness. He runs off in search of the cat, and shortly returns to say it is his friend Aristomene.
Ehi tu, dove si fa il processo per magia? Il processo contro Apuleio? Appunto.
The prosecution bursts out in protest, but as Lucio returns to his seat, the human Aristomene follows a few steps behind. Aristomene is permitted to speak and tell his side of what happened, which is that although he had cut his own throat to avoid dying by suffocation, when the centurion found him, he still had enough strength to drag himself to a nearby farmhouse to return to health. And having been separated from Lucio, he returned to Athens, never to set foot in Africa again, until he heard that Lucio had settled in Ea. And of course, now Aristomene and Lucio are as best friends as ever. Lucio additionally says that the prosecution has doctored Pudentilla's letter and presents her original message to the proconsul. In reality, Pudentilla had written that she always planned to remarry, and is disappointed that her brother no longer supported her, but instead went around telling everyone Lucio is a wizard, he bewitched her, and used magic potions to make her fall in love with him. After Pudentilla affirms that this is what she had written and what she intended to write, the proconsul declares that the truth has been bared and the charges are spurious. So the trial is over, Lucio wins, and Pudentilla is a brunette now. Please stay calm, we'll talk about the wig situation later, try not to let it distract you. They are alone together in the desert, a continuation of the scene from the beginning of the film, and when Lucio calls his wife by name, she says,
Il mio nome non è Pudentilla. Il mio nome è
Psyche, the notorious witch and the goddess to whom Lucio prayed. He asks her if any of what happened had been real.
Reale. Irreale. Ciò che è apparente non è reale. E ciò che è reale non è apparente.
For the next section, we'll dig a little deeper into the movie situation within the film scene of the 60s and 70s, and especially historical film, of which the 20th century saw a great proliferation. But by the 1970s, the whole sword and sandals genre was basically producing porn parodies of itself and blurring the lines between serious commercial film efforts and satire or softcore. Some film scholars even consider the first era of the sword and sandals genre to have ended with the fall of the Roman Empire, which was all the way back in 1964, 6 years before L'Asino d'Oro, which I think is a little bit uncharitable, although I see where those people are coming from. Even the more mainstream productions from the later half of the 60s and the early 70s, like Fellini's Satyricon and Caligula, belied a strong awareness of and often consciously interacted with established stereotypes, tropes, and conventions from the previous decades.
And I'm just adding this on because I felt like I didn't give those earlier films enough credit in terms of often how progressive they were, especially The Fall of the Roman Empire, which was from 1964 and already shows a very different approach to the Roman Empire than a lot of its predecessors, being considerably more cynical and more critical. And another part of this film that takes a very different approach than earlier movies in the same genre is Sophia Loren's character, who shows a woman as a political actor and not just a love interest. I should also point out movies like Spartacus that were very radical in a lot of ways. This was written by Dalton Trumbo, who was blacklisted during the McCarthy era and carried out a lot of his work under a pen name, and is also known for the infamous snails and oysters scene in which Crassus, played by Laurence Olivier, propositions a male slave played by Tony Curtis.
L'Asino d'Oro belongs to this new canon of historical films that blurred lines of genre, art, and propriety. After all the social upheaval of the 60s, as well as the more relaxed moral censorship, the kinds of parables that provided such fertile ground for adaptation in the 40s and 50s proved not to be quite the audience magnet that executives had thought. But despite these cultural changes, there was still government censorship of film in Italy, where the Bread and Circuses Department was responsible for viewing films that would be released domestically to provide a list of provocative moments to be cut or amended. And thank God for this, because the censorship visa was one of the only documents I could find online regarding L'Asino d'Oro. And I've mentioned it so many times before, but the researching this film was just a massive obstacle, because there are like 15 Google search results total for the entire movie, but I do at least know that this wasn't all a dream and this movie did exist. So unfortunately, the censorship visa is not terrifically informative. One of the things that was just so sad and that really prevented me from making the video that I would have wanted to make is that it seems like just nobody cared and nobody was interested enough to record much of its history at the time. And of course, even more sadly, a lot of the people who were involved firsthand are no longer with us and unable to retroactively explain any of their processes or any of their experiences or feelings. I also found this Variety listing from February 18th, 1970, in advance of the film's debut on August 27th of that year. I have no idea how it caught the attention of anybody at Variety, since its promotion outside of Italy seems to have been pretty minimal. I do think it got a release in France as well as Algeria, but the only place I could really see strong evidence of it being promoted and being screened and distributed somewhat widely was Italy. I also found a series of ads that ran for some time in La Stampa, from which I would infer Titanus, the distribution company, was courting an actual audience, and the film at least enjoyed enough success or had enough budget to continue circulating these ads in a fairly well-known and widely read newspaper. Thanks to another paper, L'Unità, we also have some bulletins that chronicle L'Asino d'Oro's theatrical run in Rome, and TV guides from later issues that give us an idea of L'Asino d'Oro as a late-night cable fixture as recent as 1991, 11 years after the film's initial release. I even came across a TV guide from this year in which it was scheduled to air. I do not think it was an official guide, so take that with a grain of salt, but despite its surprising endurance on cable, it seems to have mostly been filler for these networks, and it's difficult to come across any mention of L'Asino d'Oro online that displays any kind of warmth or enthusiasm. So did anybody want this movie? If I were to speculate on why an executive would ever greenlight something like L'Asino d'Oro, I would honestly kind of let the novel The Golden Ass and the pop culture scene of the late 60s speak for itself. Historical films were fading from vogue, but now with less scrutiny and censorship, they also provided a better opportunity to broadcast provocative topics and scenes. And if a studio put its faith in the right director, they could still scrape together a moderate hit. Spina was not that director, and while I understand that his style in this movie was divisive, I'm still not sure that I know why. The Golden Ass has held steady appeal for authors and the reading public since the Middle Ages, and provides right ground for film treatment, especially with its fast-paced plot and irreverent character, punctuated with both sexuality and philosophy. Additionally, the year prior, 1969, saw the premieres of both Fellini's Satyricon, which received widespread critical acclaim and narrowly lost out on the Italian nomination for Best Foreign Film at that year's Oscars, and Gianluigi Polidoro's Satyricon, which was less commercially successful, but which has since gained a modest cult following. My take is that the release of these two films within such a short span of time may have given studios false hope for not just modern screenplays set during Roman times, but those that are actually based on classical literature, and led to an overestimation of the demand for such adaptations. Nonetheless, I don't want to downplay the prevailing theory in online discourse that L'Asino d'Oro is simply not a good movie, which even I have to admit is pretty credible. Its brand of comedy and style of acting in particular proved polarizing, and according to the critical reviews I read, failed to deliver as both a thought-provoking perspective on Apuleius and his times, and as a commedia sexy. So both La Stampa and L'Unità published anonymous reviews, probably by a staff writer. There was no byline, so I don't know who did them, from the film's initial screenings, and they are the few relatively mainstream Italian newspapers whose digital archives are free, so those are the reviews we will be focusing on. The critical reception from both was very lukewarm and panned the writing, acting, and directing much like the modern reviews I collected online. I did find many viewers who appreciated its sense of humor and unique subject matter, but this doesn't compensate for a weak and unfocused story. And perhaps you saw this coming, but just like its source material, L'Asino d'Oro also failed to beat the Satyricon from Sheehan allegations. There were a lot of comparisons to Gianluigi Polidoro's adaptation in particular from both contemporary and modern audiences, due to its style and its handling of a classical source. I can definitely see the similarities, especially in the script and the soundtrack, even down to the way the writers adapted the story, shifting different parts around and attributing different actions and dialogue to different characters in a very similar way. But also, according to L'Unità's critic, L'Asino d'Oro fails to render either Apuleius' characters or his language compellingly and accurately, and draws from an unfocused range of classical and medieval and Renaissance interpretations. La Stampa's reviewer also criticized Spina for his uneven handling of the philosophical and the satirical. Like Polidoro, he takes a bit of a bohemian approach to his sources, which from a modern perspective can kind of come across as caricaturizing the story and the characters. Spina was actually more seasoned as a writer than as a director at this point, with only 2 previous credits behind the camera, and appears to have been known inasmuch as he was ever known for campy historical action films. I don't mind this writing style too much. I do think some of the nuance and probably some of what the reviewers were getting at was flattened by the language and the cultural barrier, so I may have missed something in the tone and the implications of the kinds of language and the kinds of acting that was going on, but it didn't affect my enjoyment personally, and it seemed to be a feature and not a bug in the way the film was made. For my part, I enjoy lighter takes on historical subjects generally, but I'll agree that The Golden Ass was maybe not the ideal opportunity. I also definitely understand where the criticism of how Spina adapted the text itself comes from too. If I had enjoyed The Golden Ass, I would be disappointed that the movie ditches so much of the novel for which it is named for a mediocre legal drama. Although I do think that streamlining the cast and restructuring the plot does give the story a much more logical and linear progression, aside from a few scenes that kind of stick out, like at the beginning with Lucio and Psyche. That one, I feel like we didn't really need that. But as a virtue of this, the characters have clearer goals and intentions, and he's able to make use of the smaller scale that he's working with. One of the biggest challenges I would see in adapting something like The Golden Ass is definitely its scope, which I think L'Inodoro meets very well. The Golden Ass is not a text that is straightforward to adapt, let alone just read and interpret, and it would be impossible to take all of the philosophy and magic and moralizing and sex and make a film that's coherent, let alone enjoyable. I think L'Inodoro did right in emphasizing Lucio's own narrative over the book's Milesian tales, which also graces the adaptation with the more linear plotline that I mentioned. Focusing on just a few places and characters was a wise choice, and it also means that the filmmakers can characterize not only Lucius, but also more minor characters like Aristomenes, Pamphile, and Milo more thoroughly. Classical novels and long-form literature tend not to be as character-driven as they are in the modern day to begin with, and comedy especially relied heavily on stock characters who were pretty much all interchangeable and had no personality, which I think is another kind of annoying thing about the novel. It's like in every scene, it's the same 3 or 4 character types all wearing different masks. L'Inodoro uses a fair amount of stereotypes and tropes too, but through the changes from the book, it does distinguish the characters a bit more, which gave me the impression of the plot and the characters working together to tell a story, rather than Lucius' narrative doing all the work and his perspective dominating everybody else's. These kinds of exaggerated tropes that Spina maps onto his characters may contribute to what the reviewer notes as the feeling of caricature. But I can also see this as just an attempt to make the characters more appealing and accessible to a modern audience. Through the camera, we're kind of forced into an omniscient third-person point of view, and although we do get Lucio's input, and Spina does in many ways attempt to specifically tell the story through his point of view, as an audience, we have a greater ability to make our own calls about what these people are like and whether they deserve our sympathy. I did see also that La Stampa characterized L'Inodoro as a satire, and again, a satire on what? It seemed to me like more of just a traditional comedy that occasionally parodied some aspects of its setting, kind of like the way an Asterix comic would. Earlier generations of historical films seem to be less critical of the stereotypes and historical misconceptions that they perpetuated, which L'Inodoro at least seems to be conscious of, even if it doesn't have too much to say about them. It is certainly critical of the Roman colonial administration in a way that I didn't expect, but which is an interesting addition to Apuleius' politics as a writer who wasn't born into the Latin language or the Roman literary tradition, and who was later excluded from the Western canon on the whole. Another difficulty that I kind of had on my mind was the fact that in the novel, Lucius relays most of the story through flashbacks, and while this works fairly well on paper, as a donkey, of course, he cannot speak and would not really be very interesting to watch, since rather than participating in many of the most interesting episodes, he either watches them happen or he overhears them. L'Inodoro used a lot of voiceovers, which we already discussed a little bit, to help keep things moving in that sense. And I felt like the fourth wall breaks also did a really good job at reminding us of that framing narrative that invites us to sympathize with Lucio as a friend telling a story. So I think both The Golden Ass and L'Inodoro are similar in many ways, and I think the film was an admirable attempt at adapting that novel, but they also have some very interesting differences. And as the most boring of these examples, I did not find the film any kind of remarkable for its handling of the story's sexual themes. It seemed to capitalize on the book's reputation rather than really engaging with it. The censorship visa only requests that the filmmakers cut a line in which a male character, probably Mario, invites Aristomene to come sleep with him, avoiding the passerotto euphemism, which the censors found objectionable, and abbreviating the love scene in the tomb. It is a pretty grisly movie. There is the disembowelment at the beginning, and then the witches all have like rotting, mummified skulls for heads that are a bit rough to look at. And like a lot of these softcore B movies from the time, there are quite a few more scenes of female nudity than male nudity, and it definitely tends to put women on display sexually more than men. But with the politics of the time period in mind, I did not find it especially exploitative either. And I think this is important within the context of the story, which often very overtly discusses or personifies men's fears about women, whether their wives cheating on them, lovers turning magic against them, and this overall fear of being controlled by a woman. And from the beginning of the movie, this theme, I see it as a very important one, where the prosecution never really clarifies the connection between Lucio and Psyche. It's probably implied in the centurion's testimony, but she is shown as the most powerful figure whom even the Roman administration is afraid of to some extent, and whom they see as a danger. And as I mentioned, this was something that struck me when I first read The Golden Ass, was feeling like Apuleius' writing is pretty misogynistic, even from that time period, and I do not think I'm being sensitive. That's something that articles have been written about. But then when I read more about his life story, I wanted to think more deeply about why he's invoking these ideas. In the book, Lucius is saved by devoting himself to Isis, and even in the film, Pudentilla or Psyche chooses to return him to his human form, if I'm even interpreting that ending correctly, and that takes Lucio's agency entirely out of his own hands, or at this point his own hooves. Landmark of feminist cinema? Obviously no, but a lot more complex and thoughtful than I thought it would be. And speaking of Psyche, you probably noticed a pretty glaring omission from L'Asino d'Oro, which is we don't actually see the story of Cupid and Psyche take place on screen in the way that we hear it being told in the book. According to Kenny, the parallels between Cupid and Lucius in the book are overt and intentional, but in a way, by assimilating the story into the fabric of the screenplay, Spina has made this even more explicit in his retelling. You'll remember Pudentilla says at the end of the film her real name is Psyche, the witch. I kind of interpreted this as Lucio prays to the goddesses, including Psyche as the goddess, and Psyche the witch is the one to answer him and return him to humanity. I might be wrong. Like Cupid and Psyche, Lucius and Pudentilla, the real historical figures, have been through a lot to get to each other. However, in the original myth, Psyche is the mortal girl who is forced to undergo dangerous ordeals in order to win her love, while Cupid is her magical seducer. In the adaptation, Lucio is actually most like Psyche, and Pudentilla is like Cupid, the powerful veiled figure who controls their relationship. Like Psyche, Lucius at the end of the book makes a journey to the underworld, this one spiritual, in order to achieve his goal. And I feel like these kinds of comparisons make sense for an adaptation that emphasizes the novel's similarities with Apuleius' real life. The trial, of course, is the major obstacle that he had to overcome, but let's also recall the unusual dynamics at play between Apuleius and Pudentilla. Marriages, especially in the educated upper classes, were very commonly arranged in ancient Rome, and it wouldn't have been remarkable for either party to have anything to gain financially or politically from their union. But Pudentilla, being the older and wealthier partner who was providing Apuleius with financial and social security, would have been unusual, and to the prosecution it was objectionable. Additionally, through her financial status and her role as a host to Apuleius when he was sick in her home, she may have wielded some kind of power over him, which Spina brought out not so much in that sense where she is kind of hosting him and tending to him, but by casting her as a witch who uses magic to control his life. And this would put Apuleius in a bit of an emasculated position. One of the accusations that Herennius and his gang brought up during the trial was that Apuleius was an effeminate and decadent character, especially in his manner of self-presentation, which they used to imply that he was a prostitute soliciting older women for money. And I wonder if the character Lucius's obsession with gender might reflect that. It's also noticeable that by characterizing Psyche or Psyche as a witch, Spina puts a very different spin on sorcery in general that is a little more sympathetic, while in the book it has a sinister effect and always backfires when Lucius tries to use it to his own benefit. Like Psyche in the myth, Lucius' curiosity also has horrible consequences for him, including the mock death of Aristomenes, but it also brings him together with Pudentilla. And meanwhile, every character who vocally disputes the existence of magic, like the legionaries and the various officials, are shown on a spectrum from totally stupid to outright evil. However, Spina downplays the role of magic in other ways, such as reducing Lucio's desire to learn witchcraft by showing it as something of a coincidence or a side effect of him trying to get with Pamphylia. And of course, just like gender, the popular narrative surrounding witchcraft has totally changed since The Golden Ass was written, when sorcery was an actual capital charge and offense on the books, even though, of course, folk traditions and stories persist throughout the world, and there's nothing wrong with that. You might have also noticed that Fortuna was not mentioned or really present at all in the film version. Rather, Rufinio and his lawyer are the much more concrete antagonists whom Lucio faces off against. The witches turn him into a donkey intentionally as a punishment for some time until Pudentilla turns him back. The only real act of fortune is the fire that destroys the miller's house. I also did get the impression that Lucio is supposed to be a softer and more gentle person in the movie, as I hope Apuleius was in real life compared to Lucius from The Golden Ass. His tendencies towards voyeurism, carnal indulgence, and passing judgment on everything are all used more effectively as a source of comedy. I think yes, because that makes him more palatable. It's easier for me, at least, to laugh at some of the things he does in the movie, because he's not actually still this awful of a person, and in the Passophori. And in case it wasn't clear enough, I absolutely do not believe that everybody who does unethical things or bad things in media needs to be punished within the narrative. This is more to do with The Golden Ass specifically, and just the novel's ability to entertain. I would also wonder if this renewed capability for reflection also comes from the film's use of the Apologia as a kind of framing narrative, since while he is pleading a case, acknowledging more vulnerable moments would help Lucio appear more sympathetic. So having discussed the movie's themes and how it expands and adds to Apuleius' literary tradition a little bit, let's discuss the artistic side. First of all, I don't know if you've noticed, but the soundtrack is incredible. I've been trying to use little sound bites from it in the transitions and the titles for this video. Hopefully not so much that it gets struck, but just enough to give you a sense of the kind of music that's just woven into the story in such a perfect way. The score is by Teo Usueli, a fairly well-known composer in the seedy underbelly of Italian film in the 70s. The main theme during the opening credits at the beginning of the film has a choir chanting kind of a martial song in Latin, which sets an interesting tone for the film and definitely speaks to the kind of commentary it provides on the role of the Roman state and the Roman Empire in Apuleius' life. It's absolutely not what I was expecting, but it's a phenomenal experience and becomes a very fun musical motif that Usueli adapted and embellished to suit different kinds of scenes. The score is another aspect of Latino d'Oro that really recalls Polidoro Satyricon, which has a soundtrack by Carlo Rustichelli, one of the GOATs. Both soundtracks have similar instrumentation. There's a choir, there's a lot of flutes, there's a lot of organs, and they both evoke kind of a similar sense of magic and antiquity and mysticism. Usueli's score has a far-out feeling that can be pretty spooky, especially through the more general sound design that emphasizes Lucio's loneliness and his fear throughout many key moments, with both ambient noise and the lack thereof. I actually looked for the soundtrack around the internet and on Discogs and everything because I started kind of like listening to movie soundtracks more on their own while I'm studying or drawing or going for a walk or whatever, and I could not find it anywhere. So I'm not sure if it was even ever released, because on Discogs, like, it's not even listed as a credit that Usually has. But it's a score that fits the story and atmosphere so amazingly well, and that truly could not have been made for any other film but this one. I also don't want to sound like I am stuck on the Satyricon parallels. I'm pretty chill about the Satyricon. But I also want to bring up Aristomenes' song, because I just feel like he could go bar for bar with Don Backey in like his early 60s like clan era.
All'immortata, l'immortalili, dimmi lo canto, l'immortalità.
And speaking of Don Backey, I have another tangentially related anecdote to discuss even more irrelevant films from the same era. We've already thoroughly covered the strong connections between the Golden Ass and the Decameron. I personally noted with special interest that Pierpaolo Pasolini wasn't the only one making Boccaccio adaptations. 1972 saw the release of Una cavalla tutto nuda, based on one of Boccaccio's tales and starring both Barbara Boucher and Don Backey.
And Leopoldo Trieste, who is actually married to Barbara Boucher in this movie.
Just while we're talking about Boccaccio, in the 1970s there was a kind of subgenre of softcore Italian film called Decamerotic or Decamerotica, which are historical films, which are historical erotic films, but which use the kind of rustic atmosphere to convey a sense of innocence and naturalism as well as realism. And I think this approach is very characteristic of L'Asinodoro as well. However, the film also cuts many of the most famous episodes which Boccaccio interpreted, and which would probably be most recognizable to the audience, in favor of focusing on Lucio and his own story. We kind of went over that already, so I won't spend too much more time on it, but it is interesting that those are kind of the episodes a viewer would most expect to see, and many of the more episodic breaks that Spina adds are significantly changed from their appearance in the book. The Miller's Wife makes sense for them to keep, because in the novel it is kind of a little onion of Milesian tales nested inside of each other, and one of the more sensational things that Lucius witnesses himself, although Spina downplays his role in the events in the story and even kind of physically distances the character Lucio from what happens. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I'm also wondering if maybe Lucio's capacity to observe without having the ability to influence what's going on reflects his diminished agency in the film version. And perhaps maybe even a reflection of how in this adaptation he is much more acquiescent to his form as a donkey, as kind of a servant to the human world.
And another effect of Lucio's perspective and the shift in the way he expresses his feelings in this movie that I hadn't really registered until now is its influence on how his character arc concludes, because in the book there's obviously this huge tonal dissonance between the way Lucius has acted and portrayed himself up until the ending, and then in the ending when he suddenly becomes transformed into a holy man without really any foreshadowing or development or build up to that point. Whereas in the film, we don't really see the side of Lucio that is super invested in morality or personal piety or anything like that. And so it makes a lot more sense. He doesn't become a priest, but the ending that he gets feels deserved, and it also feels consistent with what we see from him in the rest of the film. And it also, I think, doesn't pass any kind of moral judgment on the other events that happen in the story. It's up to the viewer to decide if they enjoyed it or not.
Another interesting change from the novel is the transposition of the story from northern Greece to North Africa. Of course, this is where the trial happened and where Apuleius had settled, so I think this change is very logical, and I appreciated that Spina didn't just do it for kind of convenience and continuity, but he also really made use of the local scenery in the backgrounds of the film, as well as bringing out some of the cultural and political dynamics that aren't even explicitly present in the Apologia. For example, there's a lot of emphasis on the differences between the Romans and their system of government versus the Numidians and the Gaetulians, which we can hear several times through the dialogue of background characters. For example, the soldiers burning the miller's house, as well as the noblewomen at the arena. Something I haven't really mentioned because it was not something I found really explicitly referenced in a lot of the sources I read, which are from European, usually Italian or Anglophone sources, is that Apuleius appears to be a bit of a point of pride for modern Amazigh people, and I'm not sure if this is an aspect of his character and his perception as a historical figure that Spina is invoking by making him, as well as a literary icon, kind of a symbol of anti-Roman imperialism and a symbol of kind of like the literary genius of the Amazigh people. That's kind of the ethnicity that Apuleius would have belonged to. And the actor they cast in the role, Sami Pavel, is from Egypt, so not super culturally accurate, but he's not a terrible actor, definitely not as bad as a lot of the reviewers say. The Lunita critic even says that Sami Pavel has less emotion than the donkey actor who plays Lucio as a donkey. You stupid communist, I can acknowledge the donkey's talent and ability to communicate its feelings, but I didn't think Pavel was bad at all. Everyone was overreacting. Considering the prevalence of dubbing in this era, you won't really find any like 60s or 70s Italian movie that really meets today's standards in terms of acting. But if you watch a few of Blasino Doro's companions within the same genre, you will appreciate a job fairly done. I especially think Barbara Boucher and Sami Pavel are a really cute couple, even though they appear to be kind of like around the same age. Pudantila's status as a widowed mother, as well as her family's role in the trial, was totally expunged from the movie, which I kind of just see as the typical pop culture squeamishness around casting older women as romantic leads. But something happened during the trial that was so funny and that was such a missed opportunity for them to do. Like, it would have still worked even with a younger woman, it would have been fine. But what had happened was one of the claims that Herennius made was that Pudentila was 60 when she married Apuleius, and to support that claim, in court the prosecution pulled out a fake birth certificate saying Pudentila was, again, 60 years old, when in reality she was 39 years old. Can you imagine? Can you imagine not just having that happen in real life, but then reading about it as a filmmaker working on the script and deciding to leave that, like leave it on the cutting room floor or whatever? But Barbara Boucher was delightful in this movie, and she has a kind of thoughtful, gentle, lit from within energy I was getting from descriptions of Pudentila herself. However, I do especially wish Sami Pavel was in more movies. I did enjoy his performance, and I thought he was a very charming, compelling protagonist, especially in his chemistry with John Steiner as Aristomene. I was so happy they gave Aristomene more screen time because we get more time to enjoy these characters interacting in the funny and endearing way that they do. This was also one of Barbara Boucher's first movies since she moved to Italy earlier in the year. Boucher had appeared in many Hollywood productions,
including the James Bond film Casino Royale,
but hoped to pursue more diverse roles in a different market. She did take on very similar projects as kind of a blonde bombshell, though she got her little brunette moment in L'Asino d'Oro, but she ended up settling in Italy and working in Italian film for the rest of her career, so she clearly found something there that she was missing in Hollywood. John Steiner was also a transplant. He was from the UK, and most of his credits are Italian. And maybe some of you watched until this point and were shocked that it's taken me so long to just find out this bit of information and for my brain to just register this bit of information. This is not a film that I have ever seen, but if John Steiner and Leopoldo Trieste sounded or looked familiar to you at all, they were in Caligula. I miss this era when they would cast anyone in anything, and it was not even a thought in the casting agent's brain of like who spoke the language fluently or who could communicate emotion in the language and what accents they had. And this isn't shade towards Barbara Boucher or John Steiner's Italian, which was obviously dubbed anyway, just like all the dialogue. Paolo Poli was another big name in the cast, but I think I kind of said everything I wanted to say about him. I'm glad he took the role, also because The Golden Ass seems to be a source he enjoyed working with and that he returned to later in his career after transitioning to theater. Even though it wasn't really for me, I do think his performance is a good example of what's so much fun about Latinodoro generally. Even though it's very self-aware, it's still full of love for the medium and the genre, where it's able to kind of lightly parody some parts of the setting and some parts of the genre without coming across as mean or cynical.
I will say one critique I have about the casting, which is Anna Zinnemann as Panfilia, because Anna Zinnemann and Barbara Boucher look so similar that I thought both of these characters were played by Barbara Boucher, and that not just Psyche and Pudentilla were the same person, but also that Psyche, Pudentilla, and Panfilia were all supposed to be the same person. The way I understand it so far, they are different people, but I think this could be distinguished a little better maybe through the casting choices or even just through styling.
I didn't realize until my second time watching the movie, but the cast list is pretty small. There are a lot of extras, and there seem to be even a few small speaking roles that are not credited, and the opening credits, which is the longest cast list, do not share the character played by each actor, so I had some trouble figuring out who was playing whom in the smaller roles like Fotide, which is too bad because I especially found Fotide's role interesting since it was so much smaller than it was in the book. So I was curious kind of why that might be. Because Lucio and Aristomene were already introduced as a pair, it would make sense that there would be two women as well. And perhaps it would make more sense for wealthy, educated Lucio to fall in love with Panfilia. I could also be way out of line, like not seeing things correctly at all with this, but it does also look like as part of filming on location, Spina was able to recruit people from around town to serve as extras in the film. Only the speaking characters appear really dressed up in hair and wardrobe, and even then, there's a real distinction between those who are really like Latinized or Romanized or whatever, who are wearing togas or stolas and sandals with their hair done up and everything, and those who are Numidian or Gaetulian, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but based on my understanding, they are still wearing what is pretty typical dress for rural North African people at this time. And I also think that helps Spina fill out his world even without a large cast or the ability to produce a lot of costumes. Which brings me to a low point of L'Asino d'Oro, that the costuming was a bit bland to me. If you need any more proof that the Quo Vadis era is dead, just look at what these people are wearing. Tell me if you've ever seen so many shades of brown in one place. They don't have to be all dressed up for a convivium at the Domus Aurea, nor would that make any sense given the time or place. It would just be nice to see a color here and there. To be generous, the video quality of the version I watched was atrocious, as you've probably seen by now, so there may have been some charming details that are unknown to my eyes. And there are some outfits I liked, like Lucio's tunic in the beginning scene. Looks like people got a little dressed up for the trial, which is nice. But overall, I just found it kind of boring. And it might be that there was just not the time or the budget. Even though I did enjoy other aspects of the production, I do really like the makeup. Overall, it just feels a bit bland to me. And I think if the filmmakers had prioritized taking risks with each character's style, it could not only elevate the visuals, but also push the characterization in a really interesting way. This movie already goes well off book in developing each character and giving them distinct personalities and senses of humor, so it's disappointing they kind of all wear brown sacks. And to show you a little bit of what I kind of would have wanted to see from L'Asino d'Oro, I am going to give you a little side-by-side comparison with one movie I found to do costumes exceptionally well, better than many of its comrades within the same genre, even those with more money, which you can probably guess where I'm going with this. It's Satyricon. Looking at the main characters, for example, we have two sets of guys who are basically the exact same itinerant philosopher character type from a somewhat well-off and Hellenized background. Without getting too much into it, of course that's an oversimplification. Lucio and Aristomene are very plainly dressed. They're wearing some dark cloaks, and underneath we have one of my personal favorites on Lucio, which is this brown trim and a sweet wave pattern, which I think is kind of like the 2nd century CE equivalent of when I think it was Shawn Mendes who showed up to the 2019 Met Gala, where the theme was camp, and he was wearing a black suit, but the black suit had like a trim, so it was camp. And here Aristomene is wearing a kind of longer white, more drapey tunic under his also unimpressive and likewise very brown cloak. I'll give them some credit here for resisting the temptation to put both of these guys in sandals since they are horseback riding through the desert. They should be wearing boots, and they are.
And now
you will see the protagonists of Satyricon, Encolpio, and Ascilto. You will see Encolpio wearing a brown tunic. That is not just a brown tunic, of course, it has gold trim. It's embroidered and it has red leggings underneath. He's also accessorizing. He has like a beaded necklace going on. And trigger warning for Franco Fabrizi and his fuck-ass bob, but if you ignore the fact that he looks like if a plastic bag of spoiled milk was on the sex offender registry, you'll see Ascilto wearing a similar kind of tunic. He's also got a necklace, he's got some cuffs. There's a lot to look at. And now for my second example, I'm not going to compare the crowd scenes in L'Asino d'Oro because again, they were going for a completely different setting and the local culture in North Africa played a big role in the look and feel of the crowd scenes.
And by that I mean I don't want to accidentally end up critiquing the culture instead of the director's choices and interpretation of that culture.
I also don't think it would be fair to compare the dinner scenes. So instead, let's look at the actors who are in costume, literally dressed up. They're dressed up for dinner at Milones. L'Asino d'Oro looks like it was filmed with a sepia filter. There's so much brown. And this is like the upper crust of society in Numidia, according to L'Asino d'Oro. And just compare it with this, like, the super casual kind of quotidian street scene from Satyricon. Here you have a crowd of people from all backgrounds, but who all, without exception, are slaughtering those wealthy and yet shabbily clad Antonines. I'm not saying Spina should have taken this approach. It was his vision, and, you know, I couldn't find, like, any interviews or anything, so I don't exactly know what he was going for, if maybe there was some point he was making. But considering how similar these two films are in terms of the directing, the acting, the script, the score, almost everything, this is just an example of like what we were robbed of, in my opinion. Also, Pudentillo's wigs are atrocious. Like, the hair is limp, it's not matching her eyebrows, it's not moving correctly in the wind. Please do better.
But the use of wigs is probably a reference to Lucius's erotic attraction to women's hair that we see in the book, as well as close-ups on Pudentillo's hair when we first meet her in the film.
The narrative also brings up some major weak points, including the timeline. The donkey's appearance at the beginning and then Lucio's brief transformation after his arrest brought up this kind of non-linear aspect to the story that went over my head a little bit. Maybe if I had understood the dialogue better, that might make sense, but I still read the transcript and, like, it was not clicking. And this is not a big deal to me because I like when movies kind of challenge the traditional ideas of a plot has to be linear and progressive and everything like that. But still, even if you're going to change up the structure, it still has to kind of make sense. For all of Spina's efforts to streamline the cast and the story, I also think it just could have been more neatly done. For example, I think the film would have benefited from introducing Pudentilla earlier and making her a more consistent character earlier in the movie as Lucius' love interest. For example, having her as a guest at Milone's house, or even as a member of the household, such as Milone's mother, whom Lucio pursues instead of Pamphylia, would have reflected how they really met, established her character traits more efficiently, and also done more justice to her powerful alter ego as Psyche without majorly disrupting subsequent events. Another confusing choice was how little time Lucio spends as a donkey. From the book, I think it was somewhere around like 6 months maybe, and Lucio really goes through just about everything, while here it looks like he just spends a few months, maybe even just a few weeks in his animal form, and the only really notable experiences that result from this are the episode at the Miller's house and with the actors. Overall, I think the most major issue of the film is the lack of organization and its inability to really resolve either the main plot or the subplots that it picks up along the way, totally independent of the novel or the history upon which it is based. The two major plots that seem to occur in the film are the trial and Lucio's romance with Pudentilla, and yet both of these feel half-baked. We spend a fair amount of time in the courtroom, but never see a verdict being delivered, and never get the payoff from Apuleius' famously fabulous defense, nor the satisfaction of the villains, Rufinio and his Roman friends, put in their places. And although I love Pudentilla and Lucio together, he seemed much more attracted to Pamphylia, whom we basically never see after the 20-minute mark, but whom we at least get to see Lucio pursuing, daydreaming, and talking about. The audience is also not treated to traditional beats of a romantic B-plot, like a love confession or a conclusive marriage or coupling scene that might help us root for the pair and understand why they should be together. But I did enjoy the little glimpses we get to see into their relationship. The balcony scene especially was so thoughtful and fascinating because it shows them connecting on an emotional and intellectual level, maybe even like a platonic level in the sense of the philosopher, not like friendship oriented. And I think this is also a nice part of their relationship to focus on because they hooked up the first time that they met, so we already know they're physically compatible. And lastly, of course, some of the jokes didn't really land. The actors, as I mentioned, I did not find funny, and some of the writing in general just feels a little dated because we live in the 2020s now. So there are some things I didn't really like, but I can't say I noticed really any major issues that single-handedly explain this movie's commercial and artistic failure. I can see how the acting especially is not to everybody's taste, but to me it kind of just felt like part of the referential, almost like
soapy
multi-camera style that Spina was adopting for this movie. I already talked about the directing in the dinner scene, which was really outstanding to me, but it's amazing throughout the film. We talked about how here it's so nice and smooth, but then if you go back to the first scene in the desert, it has a much shakier and handheld effect. And maybe I just don't watch enough movies, but to me the style seems a lot more typical of kind of later film and TV from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s that uses kind of a similar method of cinematography to emphasize certain characters' perspectives and the details that they notice through their own worldview. I like the use of a fisheye lens in this scene especially. There's a very wide variety of shots that really put us into Lucio's perspective as a donkey, which is not easy to do. I would have loved to see the storyboards for this movie because they must have just been so cool to look at. To wrap up this section, I just found so much to enjoy about this film, and what I didn't like was still interesting to think about. I would overall consider L'Asino d'Oro a pretty successful adaptation, especially since it attempts so many things that are new, bringing together different works in Apuleius' bibliography, adopting its own distinct aesthetic from other peplum films, transposing the story to a new place and context, and experimenting with the camera. Before I made this video, I was the biggest Golden Ass hater, and I hated Apuleius for writing it, but now it's like I even see him as sympathetic. That's an achievement on the part of Sergio Spina and Sami Pavel. Yet in the decades since its release, it has seen little recognition and been mostly brushed off as an amateur production of no value to the canon of ancient Roman film, often called too colloquial, too vulgar, too derivative, and too low quality. It came out at the dying end of the sword and sandals flurry with a new director and known and unknown actors from seemingly completely different niches in the industry, and flopped in the film columns and at the box offices. In many ways, it reminds me of the Golden Ass itself, left in obscurity, just because it's bad, underappreciated, underrated, begrudgingly kept around, whether for Cupid and Psyche or for Barbara Boucher's nude scenes. So let me be the first, or among the first, I don't want to give myself too much credit, to pronounce, and we're doing this again, L'Asino d'Oro, processo per fatti strani contro Lucius Apuleius, cittadino romano, a gorgeous gorgeous little gem of a film that does far more justice to Apuleius than he deserves, that distills all the poetry and creativity with which he lived his life into beautifully sensitive and self-referential dialogue that even dares to go where Gianluigi Polidoro has gone before, beyond the very horizons of narrative coherence and merry soundtracks. So is L'Asino d'Oro a forgotten masterpiece? I would say yes, but there are tens of dissenting opinions, and anyway, I strongly recommend that you watch it for yourself. It's well worth its runtime. It's only about 90 minutes, so if you watched this entire video, if my math so far is correct, you probably could have watched L'Asino d'Oro twice, and even if you dislike it, I think you'll have fun with it. There's still so much to be said about The Golden Ass and its adaptations over the millennia, and especially so much about L'Asino d'Oro that we just don't know and may never be known, but each of these works can still tell us so much about the time and culture when they were made. There's really never been anything like it in literature, for better or for worse. Often for worse, but sometimes it gives us nice things like my favorite sculpture by Antonio Canova, or the Decameron by Boccaccio, or my new favorite movie in which Sami Pavel scampers on all fours and meows like a cat. I did not expect to enjoy researching for this video as much as I did, and it's given me so much to reflect on and so much that I'm still curious about. So I doubt this will be the only time that the name of Apuleius is uttered on this channel. I hope the video was a digestible synthesis of just a few of some of the most important themes and ideas that came up in his work, and I hope you enjoyed this little trip through the ages with Apuleius. Again, please check out the sources if you want to read more. I really do hope L'Asino d'Oro gets restored someday. I especially really hope it gets a soundtrack release. It is just a fascinating movie, and it has so many amazing people in front of and behind the camera. I just really wish there was more out there about this film. But if you happen to know of anything that I missed, or even just have suggestions of where to look, please feel free to share, because I would be so excited to do a follow-up if anything new comes to light, or if I have any corrections or amendments to make. So I'll see if I have to go back and edit this video or just make a new one. But please also stick around for more videos like this, especially if you enjoy watching movies and thinking about ancient Rome as much as I do. I know this is my first time doing like a video essay, like a film review, but if people seem interested, that will be a really great sign and great motivation for me to keep doing it. And I'm also super open to suggestions about what to research or what to watch next. So if you're not already, please subscribe with the bell icon, because this took me 5 months to make, so who knows when I'll upload the next one. And to be honest, I do not really check YouTube comments that often, but if you need to get in touch with me, which I encourage, all my socials are linked in the description and in my card and my about page, but definitely leave one for the algorithm if you're inclined to do that. Let me know what you think about Apuleius or any of the adaptations and interpretations we discussed today. If you need a prompt, if you were suddenly turned into a donkey, what would you do? I think I would eat some dandelions, I would frolic, and then I would lie down in the shade, and I might roll around in some dirt. Let me know, and I'll try and pin the cutest answer, or the answer. I don't know how many of you there will be. You can find me on Instagram, Tumblr, and Twitter with the exact same username, and I have more links to those sites in my card below, as well as places you can buy my art if you'd like to support me financially. And I actually have a letterbox if you'd like to keep up with what I'm watching. Thank you so much for your time today. See you soon. Valete.
Noi vorremmo regalar un dono tanto grande che più grande non ce l'ha. All'immortata, l'immortalilli, dimmi lo canto l'immortalità. All'immortata, l'immortalilli, doniamo a Milo l'immortalità.